Chapter 11 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 11 Huck and the Woman. The Search. Prevarication. Going to Goshen.
"Come in,"
says the woman, and I did. She says,
"take a chair."
I done it. She looked me all over with her little shiny eyes and says,
"What might your name be?
Sarah Williams.
Whereabouts do you live? In this neighborhood?"
No, Mum. In Hookerville, 7 mile below. I've walked all the way, and I'm all tired out.
"Hungry too, I reckon. I'll find you something."
No, Mum. I ain't hungry. I was so hungry I had to stop 2 miles below here's at a farm, so I ain't hungry no more. It's what makes me so late. My mother's down sick, and out of money and everything, and I come to tell my Uncle Abner Moore. He lives at the upper end of the town, she says. I ain't ever been here before. Do you know him?
"No, but I don't know everybody yet. I haven't lived here quite 2 weeks. It's a considerable ways to the upper end of town. You better stay here all night. Take off your bonnet."
No, I says. I'll rest a while, I reckon, and go on. I ain't afeared of the dark. She said she wouldn't let me go by myself, but her husband would be in by and by, maybe in an hour and a half, and she'd send him along with me. Then she got to talking about her husband, and about her relations up the river, and her relations down the river, and about how much better off they used to was, and how they didn't know but they'd made a mistake coming to our town, instead of letting well alone, and so on, till I was afeared I had made a mistake coming to her, to find out what was going on in the town. But by and by she dropped on to pap, and the murder, and then I was pretty willing to let her clatter right along. She told about me and Tom Sawyer finding the $6,000, only she got it 10, and all about pap, and what a hard lot he was, and what a hard lot I was, and at last she got down to where I was murdered. I says, Who done it? We've heard considerable about these goings on down in the Hookerville, but we don't know who 'twas that killed Huck Finn.
"Well, I reckon there's a right smart chance of people here that'd like to know who killed him. Some think old Finn did it himself."
No, is that so?
"Most everybody thought it at first. He'll never know how nigh he come to getting lynched, but before night they changed around and judged it was done by a runaway nigger named Jim."
Why I stopped. I reckoned I'd better keep still. She run on, and never noticed I had put in at all.
"The nigger run off the very night Huck Finn was killed, so there's a reward out for him, $300. And there's a reward out for old Finn too, $200. You see, he come to town the morning after the murder and told about it, and was out with him on the ferryboat hunt, and right away after he up and left. Before night they wanted to lynch him, but he was gone, you see. Well, next day they found out the nigger was gone. They found out he hadn't been since 10 o'clock, the night the murder was done. So then they put it on him, you see, and while they was full of it, next day back comes old Finn, and went boo-hooing to Judge Thatcher to get money to hunt for the nigger all over Illinois with. The judge gave him some, and that evening he got drunk, and was around till after midnight with a couple of mighty hard-looking strangers, and then went off with them. Well, he ain't come back since, and they ain't looking for him back till this thing blows over a little, for people thinks now that he killed his boy and fixed things so folks would think robbers done it, and then he'd get Huck's money without having to bother a long time with a lawsuit. People do say he warn't any too good to do it. Oh, he's sly, I reckon. If he don't come back for a year he'll be all right. You can't prove anything on him, you know. Everything will be quieted down then, and he'll walk in Huck's money as easy as nothing."
Yes, I reckon so. I don't see nothing in the way of it. Has everybody quit thinking the nigger done it?
"Oh no, not everybody. A good many thinks he done it, but they'll get the nigger pretty soon now, and maybe they can scare it out of him."
Why? Are they after him yet?
"Well, you're innocent, ain't you? Just $300 lay around every day for people to pick up. Some folks think the nigger ain't far from here. I'm one of them, but I ain't docked it around. A few days ago I was talking with an old couple that lives next door in the log shanty, and they happen to say hardly anybody never goes to that island over yonder they call Jackson's Island. Don't anybody live there, says I? No, nobody, says they. I didn't say any more, but I done some thinking. I was pretty near sartin I'd seen smoke over there, about the head of the island, a day or two before that. So I says to myself, like as not that nigger's hiding over there. Anyway, says I, it's worth the trouble to give the place a hunt. I hain't seen any smoke since, so I reckon maybe he's gone, if it was him, but husband's going over to see. Him and another man. He was gone up the river, but he got back today, and I told him as soon as he got here 2 hours ago.
I had got so uneasy I couldn't sit still. I had to do something with my hands, so I took up a needle off of the table and went to threading it. My hands shook, and I was making a bad job of it. When the woman stopped talking I looked up, and she was looking at me pretty curious and smiling a little. I put down the needle and thread and let on to be interested. And I was, too. I says, $300 is a power of money. I wish my mother could get it. Is your husband going over there tonight?
Oh, yes. He went uptown with the man I was telling you of to get a boat and see if they could borrow another gun. They'll go over after midnight.
Couldn't they see better if they was to wait till daytime?
Yes, and couldn't the nigger see better, too? After midnight he'll likely be asleep, and they can slip around through the woods and hunt up his campfire, all the better for the dark if he's got one.
I didn't think of that. The woman kept looking at me pretty curious, and I didn't feel a bit comfortable. Pretty soon she says,
What'd you say your name was, honey?
Mary Williams? Somehow it didn't seem to me that I said it was Mary before, so I didn't look up. Seemed to me I said it was Sarah, so I felt sort of concerned, and was afeared maybe I was looking it too. I wished the woman would say something more. The longer she sat still, the uneasier I was. But now she says,
Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first came in.
Oh, yes'm, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some calls me Sarah, some calls me Mary.
Oh, that's the way of it.
Yes'm. I was feeling better then, but I wished I was out of there anyway. I couldn't look up yet. Well, the woman fell to talking about how hard times was, and how poor they had to live, and how the rats was as free as if they owned the place, and so forth and so on, and then I got easy again. She was right about the rats. You'd see one stick his nose out of a hole in the corner every little while. She said she had to have things handy to throw at them when she was alone, or they wouldn't give her no peace. She showed me a bar of lead twisted up into a knot, and said she was a good shot with it generally, but she'd wrenched her arm a day or two ago, and didn't know whether she could throw true now. But she watched for a chance, and directly banged away at the rat, but she missed him wide, and said,
Ouch!
It hurt her arm so. Then she told me to try for the next one. I wanted to be getting away before the old man got back, but of course I didn't let on. I got the thing, and the first rat that showed his nose I let drive, and if he'd a stayed where he was, he'd a been a tolerable sick rat. She said that was first rate, and she reckoned I would have the next one. She went and got the lump of lead and fetched it back, and brought along a hank of yarn which she wanted me to help her with. I held up my two hands, and she put the hank over them, and went on talking about her and her husband's matters, but she broke off to say,
Keep your eye on the rat. You better have the lead in your lap handy.
So she dropped the lump into my lap just at that moment, and I clapped my legs together on it, and she went on talking, but only about a minute. Then she took off the hank and looked at me straight in the face, and very pleasant, and says,
Come now, what's your real name?
What, Mum?
What's your real name? Is it Bill or Tom or Bob or what is it?
I reckon I shook like a leaf, and I didn't know hardly what to do, but I says, Please don't poke fun at poor little girl like me, Mum. If I'm in the way here, I'll—
No, you won't. Sit down and stay where you are. I ain't going to hurt you, and I ain't going to tell any other. You just tell me your secret and trust me. I'll keep it, and what's more, I'll help you. So will my old man if you want him to. You see, you're a runaway prentice, that's all. It ain't anything. There ain't no harm in it. You've been treated bad, and you made up your mind to cut. Bless you, child, I wouldn't tell on you. Tell me all about it now, that's a good boy.
So I said it wouldn't be no use to try to play it any longer, and I would just make a clean breast and tell her everything, but she mustn't go back on her promise. Then I told her my father and mother was dead, and the law had bound me out to a mean old farmer in the country 30 mile back from the river, and he treated me so bad I couldn't stand it no longer. He went away to be gone a couple of days, and so I took my chance and stole some of his daughter's old clothes and cleared out. And I had been 3 nights coming the 30 miles. I travelled nights, and hid daytimes and slept, and the bag of bread and meat I carried from home lasted me all the way, and I had a plenty. I said I believed my Uncle Abner Moore would take care of me, so that was why I struck out for this town of Goshen.
Goshen, child? This ain't Goshen. This is St. Petersburg. Goshen's 10 mile further up the river. Who told you this was Goshen?
Why, a man I met at daybreak this morning, just as I was going to turn into the woods for my regular sleep. He told me when the roads forked I must take the right road, and 5 mile would fetch me to Goshen.
He was drunk, I reckon. He told you just exactly wrong.
Well, he did act like he was drunk, but it ain't no matter now. I got to be moving along. I'll fetch Goshen before daylight.
Hold on a minute. I'll put you up a snack to eat. You might want it.
So she put me up a snack and says,
Say, when a cow's laying down, which end of her gets up first? Answer up prompt now. Don't stop to study over it. Which end gets up first?
"The hind end, mum."
Well then, a horse.
"The forward end, mum."
Which side of a tree does the moss grow on?
"The north side."
If 15 cows is browsing on a hillside, how many of them eats with their heads pointed the same direction?
"The whole 15, mum."
Well, I reckon you have lived in the country. I thought maybe you was just trying to hocus me again. What's your real name now?
"George Peters, mum."
Well, try to remember it, George. Don't forget and tell me it's Alexander before you go, and then get out by saying it's George Alexander when I catch you. And don't go about women in that old calico. You do a girl tolerable poor, but you might fool men, maybe. Bless you, child, when you set out to thread a needle, don't hold the thread still and fetch the needle up to it. Hold the needle still and poke the thread at it. That's the way a woman most always does, but a man always does it t'other way. And when you throw at a rat or anything, hitch yourself up a tiptoe and fetch your hand up over your head as awkward as you can, and miss your rat about 6 or 7 foot. Throw stiff-armed from the shoulder, like there was a pivot there for it to turn on, like a girl, not from the wrist and elbow, with your arm out to one side, like a boy. And mind you, when a girl tries to catch anything in her lap, she throws her knees apart. She don't clap 'em together, the way you did when you catched the lump of lead. Why, I spotted you for a boy when you was threading the needle, and I contrived the other things just to make certain. Now trot along to your uncle, Sarah Mary Williams George Alexander Peters, and if you get into trouble, you send word to Mrs. Judith Loftus, which is me, and I'll do what I can to get you out of it. Keep the river road all the way, and next time you tramp take shoes and socks with you. The river road's a rocky one, and your feet'll be in a condition when you get to Goshen, I reckon.
I went up the bank about 50 yards, and then I doubled on my track and slipped back to where my canoe was, a good piece below the house. I jumped in, and was off in a hurry. I went upstream far enough to make the head of the island, and then started across. I took off the sunbonnet, for I didn't want no blinders on then. When I was about the middle, I heard the clock begin to strike, so I stops and listens. The sound come faint over the water, but clear 11. When I struck the head of the island, I never waited to blow, though I was most winded, but I shoved right into the timber where my old camp used to be, and started a good fire there on a high and dry spot. Then I jumped in the canoe and dug out for our place, a mile and a half below, as hard as I could go. I landed and sloped through the timber and up the ridge and into the cavern. There Jim laid, sound asleep on the ground. I roused him out and says, "Get up and hump yourself, Jim. There ain't a minute to lose. They're after us." Jim never asked no questions. He never said a word, but the way he worked for the next half an hour showed about how he was scared. By that time everything we had in the world was on our raft, and she was ready to be shoved out from the willow cove where she was hid. We put out the campfire at the cavern the first thing. I didn't show a candle outside after that. I took the canoe out from the shore a little piece, and took a look, but if there was a boat around I couldn't see it, for stars and shadows ain't good to see by. Then we got out the raft and slipped along down in the shade, past the foot of the island dead still, never saying a word. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 12. Slow Navigation, Borrowing Things, Boarding the Wreck, The Plotters, Hunting for the Boat. It must have been close on to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was to come along, we was going to take to the canoe and break for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we hadn't ever thought to put the gun in the canoe, or a fishing line, or anything to eat. We was in rather too much of a sweat to think of so many things. It weren't good judgment to put everything on the raft. If the men went to the island, I'd just expect they found the campfire I built, and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them, it weren't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show, we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side, and tacked off cottonwood branches with the hatchet, and covered up the raft with 'em so she looked like there had been a cave-in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We had mountains on the Missouri shore, and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down the Missouri shore at the place, so we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day, and watched the rafts and the steamboats spin down the Missouri shore, and up-bound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about the time I had jabbered with that woman, and Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself, she wouldn't sit down and watch a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said he bet she did think of it by the time the man was ready to start, and he believed they must have gone uptown to get a dog, and so they lost all that time, or else we wouldn't be here on a towhead 16 or 17 mile below the village. No, indeedy, we would be in the same old town again. So I said I didn't care what was the reason they didn't get us as long as they didn't. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket, and looked up and down and across, nothing in sight. So Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy, and to keep the things dry. Jim made a floor for the wigwam, and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft, so now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of the steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep, with a frame around it for to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam would keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar, too, because one of the others might get broke on a snag or something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hang the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream, to keep from getting run over and we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats, unless we see we was in what they call a crossing, for the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little under water, so upbound boats didn't always run the channel, but hunted easy water. The second night we run between 7 and 8 hours, with a current that was making over 4 mile an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big still river, laying on our backs, looking up at the stars, and we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it weren't often that we laughed, only a little kind of low chuckle. We had mighty good weather, as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all, that night or the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides, nothing but just a shiny bed of lights, not a house could you see. The fifth night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There weren't a sound there. Everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village, and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. And sometimes I lifted a chicken that weren't roosting comfortable and took him along. Pop always says, take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you didn't want him yourself, you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot. I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Mornings before daylight I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon, or a mushmelon, or a punkin, or some new corn, or things of that kind. Pap always said it weren't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back sometime, but the widow said I weren't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right, and Pap was partly right, so the best way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them any more. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, drifting along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons, or the cantaloupes, or the mushmelons, or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory, and concluded to drop crab apples and persimmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was all comfortable now. I was glad the way it come out too, because crab apples ain't ever good, and the persimmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot a waterfowl now and then that got up too early in the morning, or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all round, we lived pretty high. The fifth night below St. Louis we had a big storm after midnight, with a power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning glared out, we could see a big straight river ahead, and high, rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by, says I, "Hello, Jim, looky yonder." It was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. We was drifting straight down for her. The lightning showed her very distinct. She was leaning over, with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimbly guy clean and clear, and a chair by the big bell, with an old slouch hat hanging on the back of it, when the flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy, and all too mysterious like, I felt just the way any other boy would. I felt, when I see that wreck lying there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river, I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little and see what there was. So I says, "Let's land on her, Jim." but Jim was dead against it at first. He says,
I don't want to go foolin' long o' no wreck. We's doin' blame well, and we better let blame well alone, as the good book says. Like as not they's a watchman on dat wreck.
"Watchman your grandmother," I says. "There ain't nothing to watch but the Texas, and the pilot house, and do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash off down the river any minute?" Jim couldn't say nothing to that, so we didn't try. And besides, I says, we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Seegers, I bet you, and cost 5 cents apiece, solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich, and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs, you know, long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket. I can't rest, Jim, till we give her a rummaging. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go by this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure, that's what he'd call it, and he'd land on that wreck, if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread himself nor nothing? Why, you'd think it was Christopher Columbus, discoverin' kingdom come. I wish Tom Sawyer was here. Jim grumbled a little, but give in. He said we mustn't talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick, and made fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking down the slopes of it to larboard in the dark, towards the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, and spreading our hands out to fend off the guys. For it was so dark we couldn't see no sign of them. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb onto it, and the next step fetched us in front of the captain's door, which was open, and by Jiminy, away down through the Texas Hall we see a light, and all in the same second we seemed to hear low voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said he was feeling powerful sick, and told me to come along. I says, all right, and was going to start for the raft, but just then I heard a voice wail out and say,
"Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell."
Another voice said, pretty loud,
"It's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more than your share of the truck, and you've always got it too, because you swore it. If you didn't, you'd tell. This time, you said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherous hound in this country."
By this time Jim was gone for the raft. I was just a billin' with curiosity, and I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm a goin' to see what's goin' on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in the little passage, and crept aft in the dark, till there weren't but one stateroom betwixt me and the cross hall of the Texas. Then in there I see a man stretched on the floor, and tied hand and foot, and 2 men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand, and the other one had a pistol. This one kept pointing the pistol at the man's head on the floor and saying,
"I'd like to, and I ought to too. A mean skunk."
The man on the floor would shrivel up and say,
"Oh, please don't, Bill. I ain't ever going to tell."
and every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say,
"'Deed you ain't. You never said no truer thing than that, you bet you."
And once he said,
Hear him beg. And yet if we hadn't got the best of him and tied him, he'd a killed us both. And what for? Just for nothing. Just 'cause we stood on our rights, that's what for. But I lay you ain't a-goin' to threaten nobody any more, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill.
Bill says,
"I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm for killing him. And didn't he kill old Hatfield just the same way? And don't he deserve it?
But I don't want him killed, and I've got my reasons for it.
Bless your heart for them words, Jake Packard. I'll never forget you long as I live,
says the man on the floor, sort of blubbering. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail, and started towards where I was there, in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could, about 2 yards, but the boat slanted so that I couldn't make very good time. So to keep from getting run over and catched, I crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The man came a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packard got to my stateroom, he says,
Here, come in here.
and in he come, and Bill after him. But before they got in, I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I come. Then they stood there with their hands on the ledge of the berth, and talked. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't make much difference anyway, because most of the time they couldn't a-treed me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared, and besides, a body couldn't breathe and hear much talk. They talked low and earnest. Bill wanted to kill Turner. He says,
He said he'll tell, and he will. If we was to give him both our shares to him now, it wouldn't make no difference after the row and the way we've served him. Sure as you're born, he'll turn state's evidence. Now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles.
So am I.
says Packard, very quiet.
Blame it. I sort of begun to think you wasn't. Well, then, that's all right. Let's go and do it.
Hold on a minute. I ain't had my say yet. You listen to me. Shooting's good, but there's quieter ways if the thing's got to be done. What I say's this. It ain't good sense to go courting round after a halter if you can get at what you're up to in some way that's just as good, and at the same time don't bring you into no risks. Ain't that so?
You bet it is. But how you gonna manage it this time?
Well, my idea's this. We'll rustle around and gather up whatever pickings we've overlooked in the staterooms, and shove for shore and hide the truck. Then we'll wait. Now I say, it ain't a-going to be more'n 2 hours before this wreck breaks up and washes off down the river. See? He'll be drownded, and won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better than killing of him. I'm unfavorable to killing a man as long as you can get around it. It ain't good sense. It ain't good morals. Ain't I right?
Yes, I reckon you are. But suppose she don't break up and wash off.
Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we?
All right then. Come along.
So they started, and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said, in a kind of a coarse whisper, "Jim!" and he answered up, right at my elbow, with a sort of a moan, and I says, "Quick, Jim! It ain't no time for fooling around and moaning. There is a gang of murderers in yonder, and if we don't hunt up their boat, and set her drifting down the river so these fellows can't get away from the wreck, there's one of 'em going to be in a bad fix. But if we find their boat, we can put all of 'em in a bad fix, for the sheriff'll get 'em. Quick, hurry! I'll hunt the larboard side. You hunt the starboard. You start at the raft, and—"
Oh, my lordy, lordy. Raft, they ain't no raft no more. She done broke loose and gone. And here we is.
End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 13. Escaping from the Wreck. The Watchman. Sinking. Well, I catched my breath, and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it weren't no time to be sentimentering. We'd got to find that boat now. Had to have it for ourselves. So we went a quaking and shaking down the starboard side. And slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further. So scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on. If we get left on this wreck, we are in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas, and found it, and then scrambled along forwards on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was a skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men struck his head out only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone, but he jerked it in again, and says,
Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill.
He flung a bag of something into the boat, and then got in himself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill he come out and got in. Packard says, in a low voice,
All ready. Shove off.
I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says,
Hold on. Did you go through him?
No. Didn't you?
No. So he's got his share of the cash yet.
Well, then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money.
Say, won't he suspicion what we're up to?
Maybe he won't, but we got to have it anyway. Come along.
So they got out and went in. The door slammed, too, because it was on the careen side, and in a half a second I was in the boat, and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak no whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box, and past the stern. Then, in a second or two more, we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe, and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we seen the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat, and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no tellin' but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So says I to Jim, the first light we see, we'll land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you in the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn, and get somebody to go for that gang, and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes. But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down, and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain lit up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was a raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right, on shore. So I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder, which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it on to the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down, and show a light when he judged he had gone about 2 mile, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars, and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it, 3 or 4 more showed, up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shorelight, and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging on the jackstaff of a double-hull ferry-boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, a-wonderin' whereabouts he slept, and by I found him roostin' on the bitts forward, and his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves, and began to cry. He stirred up in a kind of a startleish way, but when he sees it was only me, he took a good gapin' stretch, and then he says,
"Hello, what's up? Don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?"
I says, "Pap and Mam and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says,
"Oh, dang it now, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles, and this'll come out all right. What's the matter with him?"
"There, there, are you the watchman of the boat?"
"Yes,
he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like.
I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and watchman and head deck hand. And sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blame generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does. But I've told him a many a time I wouldn't trade places with him, for, says I, a sailor's life's the life for me, and I'm durned if I'd live 2 mile out of town where there ain't nothing ever goin' on, not for all his spondylux and as much more on top of it, says I.
I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and—"
"Who is?"
"Why, Pap and Mam and Sis and Miss Hooker. And if you take your ferry boat and go up there—"
"Up where? Where are they?"
"On the wreck."
"What wreck?"
"Why, there ain't but one."
"What, you don't mean the Walter Scott?"
"Yes."
"Good land! What are they doing there, for gracious sakes?"
"Well, they didn't go there a purpose."
"I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?"
"Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a-visiting up there to the town."
"Yes, Booth's Landing. Go on."
"She was a-visiting there at Booth's Landing, and just in the edge of the evening she started over with her nigger woman in the horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house. Miss What you may call her, I disremember her name, and they lost their steering oar, and swung around and went a-floating down, stern first, about 2 mile, and saddle-bagsed on the wreck, and the ferryman, and the nigger woman, and the horses was all lost. But Miss Hooker, she made a grab, and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark, we come along down in our trading scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddle-bagsed, but all of us was saved but Bill Wimple, and oh, he was the best creature. I most wished it had been me, I do."
By George, it's the beatenest thing I ever struck. And then what did you all do?"
"Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide there we couldn't make nobody hear, so Pap said somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it, and Miss Hooker she said if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below, and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something, but they said, 'What, in such a night, and such a current? There ain't no sense in it. Go for the steam ferry.' Now if you'll go and
By Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it, I don't know but I will. But who in the dingnation's a goin' to pay for it? Do you reckon your papa?
why that's all right. Miss Hooker, she told me, particular, that her Uncle Hornback.
Great guns! Is he her uncle? Looky here. You break for that light over yonder way, and turn out west when you get there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern. Tell him to dart you out to Jim Hornback's, and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself now. I'm a-going up around the corner here to roust out my engineer.
I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner, I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards, and tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would ha' done it. I wish the widow knowed about it. I judge she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long, here comes the wreck, dim and dusty, sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there weren't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her, and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. Then there comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach, I laid on my oars, and looked back and see her go, and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them. And then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went a-booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show it looked like it was 1,000 miles off. By the time I got there, the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for an island, and hid the raft, and sunk the skiff, and turned in, and slept like dead people. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 14 A General Good Time. The Harem. French. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off of the wreck, and found boots and blankets and clothes, and all sorts of other things, and a lot of books, and a spyglass, and 3 boxes of cigars. We hadn't ever been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking, and me reading the books, and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck, and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures, but he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went in the Texas, and he crawled back to get on the raft, and found her gone, he nearly died, because he judged it was all up to him anyway, it could be fixed. For if he didn't get saved, he would get drownded, and if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home, so as to get the reward, and then Miss Watson would sell him south, sure. Well, she was right. He was most always right. He had an uncommon level head for a nigger. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed, and how much style they put on, and called each other your majesty, and your grace, and your lordship, and so on, instead of mister, and Jim's eyes bugged out, and he was interested. He says,
I didn't know dey was so many on 'em. I hain't hearn 'bout none on 'em, scarcely, but old King Solomon, unless you counts dem kings that's in a pack of kyards. How much do a king get?
Get? I says, why, they get $1,000 a month if they want it. They can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them.
Ain't that gay? And what they got to do, Huck?
They don't do nothing. Why, how you talk. They just sit around.
No, is that so?
Of course it is. They just sit around, except maybe when there's a war. Then they go to the war. But other times, they just lazy around, or just talking. Just talking and Shh! Do you hear the noise? We skipped out and looked, but it weren't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel away down, coming around the point. So we come back. Yes, says I, and other times, when things is dull, they fuss with the Parliament, and if everybody don't go just so, he whacks their heads off, but mostly they hang around the harem.
Round the which?
Harem.
What's the harem?
The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one. He had about 1,000,000 wives.
Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem's a boarding house, I reckon. Most likely they has rackety times in the nursery. And I reckon the wives quarrels considerable, and that creased the racket. Yet they say Solomon the wisest man that ever live. I don't take no stock in that. Because why would a wise man want to live in the midst of such a blim-blamming all the time? No, 'deed he wouldn't. A wise man had taken build a biller factory, and then he could shut down the biller factory when he wants to rest.
Well, but he was the wisest man, anyway, because the widow, she told me so, her own self.
I don't care what the widder say. He warn't no wise man nother. He had some of the dad-fetchedest ways I ever see. Does you know 'bout that child that he is going to chop in two?
Yes, the widow told me all about it.
Well den, warn't that the beatin'est notion in the world? You just take and look at it a minute. Dar's the stump, dar. That's one of the women. Here's you. That's the yother one. I's Solomon, and this yere dollar bill's the child. Before'n you's claim it, what does I do? Does I shin around among the neighbors and find out which un of you the bill do belong to, and hand it over to the right one, all safe and sound, the way that anybody that had any gumption would? No, I take and whack the bill in two, and give half on it to you, and the other half to the other woman. That's the way Solomon was going to do it with the child. Now I want to ask you, what's the use of that half a bill? Can't buy nothing with it. And what use is half a child? I wouldn't give a dern for 1,000,000 on 'em.
But hang it, Jim, you've clean missed the point. Blame it, you've missed it 1,000 mile.
Who, me? Go along, don't talk to me about yo' pence. I reckon I knows sense when I sees it, and they ain't no sense in such doing as that. Disputed wa'n't 'bout a half a child. Dispute was 'bout a whole child, And the man that think he can settle a 'spute about a whole child with a half a child don't know enough to come in out of the rain. Don't talk to me about Solomon, Huck. I knows him by the back.
But I tell you, you don't get the point.
Blame the point. I reckon I knows what I knows. And mind you, the real punt is down ye furder. It's down deeper. It lays in the way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got only 1 or 2 children. Is that man going to be wasteful of children? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He knows how to value 'em. But you take a man that's got about 5 million children running round the house, and it's different. He as soon chop a child in two as a cat. There's plenty more. A child or two, more or less, want no consequence to Solomon. Dad fetch him.
I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there weren't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see, so I went to talking about other kings, and let Solomon slide. I told him about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France a long time ago, and about his little boy, the Dolphin, that would have been a king, but they took him and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there.
Po' little chap.
But some says he got out and got away, and come to America.
That's good, but he'll be pooty lonesome. They ain't no kings here, is there, Huck?
No.
Then he can't get no situation. What he going to do?
Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police, and some of them learns people how to talk French.
Why, Huck, don't the French people talk the same way we does?
No, Jim, you couldn't understand a word they said. Not a single word.
Well, now, I be ding busted. How did that come?
I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, Parlez-vous français? What would you think?
I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head. That is, if he want white. I wouldn't low no nigger to call me that.
Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French?
Well, then why couldn't he say it?
Why, he is a saying it. It's a Frenchman's way of saying it.
Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. There ain't no sense in it.
Looky here, Jim. Does a cat talk like we do?
No, a cat don't.
Well, does a cow?
No, a cow don't nother.
Does a cat talk like a cow, or a cow talk like a cat?
No, they don't.
It's natural and right for 'em to talk different from each other, ain't it?
Course.
And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us?
Why, most surely it is.
Well then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that.
Is a cat a man, Huck?
No.
Well, then, there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man, or is a cow a cat?
No. She ain't either of 'em.
Well, then, she ain't got no business to talk like either one or the other of 'em. Is a Frenchman a man?
Yes.
Well, then, dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that.
I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue. So I quit. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 15. Huck loses the raft. In the fog. Huck finds the raft. Trash. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo, at the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sail the raft and get on a steamboat, and go way up the Ohio, amongst the free states, and then to be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to, for it wouldn't do to try to run in a fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe, with the line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed the line around one of them, right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was a stiff current, and the raft came booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots, and away she went. I see the fog closing down, and it made me so sick and scared I couldn't budge for most half a minute, it seemed to me, and then there weren't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. I jumped into the canoe, and run back to the stern, and grabbed the paddle, and set her back a stroke, but she didn't come. I was in such a hurry I hadn't untied her. I got up and tried to untie her, but I was so excited my hands shook so I couldn't hardly do anything with them. As soon as I got started I took out after the raft, hot and heavy, right down the towhead. That was all right, as far as it went, but the towhead weren't 60 yards long, and the minute I flew by the foot of it I shot out into the solid white fog, and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. Thinks I, it wouldn't do to paddle. First I know, I'll run into the bank, or a towhead, or something. I got to sit still and float, and yet it's mighty fidgety business to have to hold your hand still at such a time. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewheres I hears a small whoop, and up comes my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come, I see I weren't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it, and the next time I was heading away to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either, for I was flying around this way and that and t'other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. I did wish the fool would think to beat a tin pan, and beat it all the time, but he never did, and it was the still places between the whoops that was making the trouble for me. Well, I fought along, and directly I hears the whoop behind me. I was tangled good now. That was somebody else's whoop, or else I was turned around. I throwed the paddle down. I heard the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept coming, and kept changing its place, and I kept answering, till by and by it was in front of me again, and I knowed the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim, and not some other raftsman hollerin'. I couldn't tell nothing about voices in a fog, for nothing didn't look natural nor sound natural in a fog. The whooping went on, and in about a minute I come a boomin' down on a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by, amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared. The current was tearing by them so swift. In another second or two it was solid white and still again. I sat perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump, and I reckon I didn't draw a breath while it thumped 100. I just give up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down to other side of it. It weren't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. It had the big timber of a regular island. It might be 5 or 6 miles long, and more than a half a mile wide. I kept quiet, with my ears cocked, about 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you didn't ever think of that. No, you feel like you are laying dead still on the water, and if a little glimpse of a snag slips by you, don't think to yourself how fast you're going, but you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in a fog that way, by yourself in the night? You try it once, you'll see. Next, for about half an hour, I whoops now and then. At last I hears the answer a long ways off, and tries to follow it, but I couldn't do it. Indirectly, I judged I got into a nest of towheads, for I had little dim glimpses of them on both sides of me, sometimes just a narrow channel between, and some that I couldn't see. I knowed was there, because I hear the wash of the current against the old dead brush and trash that hung over the banks. Well, I weren't long losing the whoops down amongst the towheads, and I only tried to chase them a little while, anyway, because it was worse than chasing a jack-o'-lantern. You never knowed a sound dodge around so, and swamp places so quick and so much. I had to claw away from the bank pretty lively 4 or 5 times to keep from knocking the islands out of the river, and so I judged the raft must be butting into the bank every now and then, or else it would get further ahead and clear out of hearing. It was floating a little faster than what I was. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckon Jim had fetched up on a snag, maybe, and it was all up with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it, so I thought I would take just one little cat nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat nap, for when I waked up, the stars was shining bright, the fog was all gone, and I was spinning down a big bend stern first. First, I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming, and when things began to come back to me, they seemed to come up dim out of last week. It was a monstrous big river here, with the tallest and the thickest kind of timber on both banks, just a solid wall, as well as I could see by the stars. I looked away downstream and seen a black speck on the water. I took after it, but when I got to it, it weren't nothing but a couple of saw logs made fast together. Then I see another speck, and chased that, then another, and this time I was right. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was setting there with his head down between his knees asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off, and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt. So she'd had a rough time. I made fast and laid down under Jim's nose on the raft, and began to gap, and stretched my fists out against him, and says, "Hello, Jim. Have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?"
Goodness gracious, is that you, Huck? And you ain't dead. You ain't drowned. You's back again. Oh, it's too good for true, honey. It's too good for true. Let me look at you, child. Let me feel of you. No, you ain't dead. You's back again, live and sound, just the same old Huck. The same old Huck. Thanks to goodness.
"What's the matter with you, Jim? You been a-drinking?"
Drinking? Has I been a-drinking? Has I had a chance to be a-drinking?
"Well, then, what makes you talk so wild?"
How does I talk wild?
"How? Why, hain't you been talking about my coming back, and all that stuff, as if I had been gone away?"
Huck Finn, you look me in the eye. Look me in the eye. Ain't you been gone away?
"Gone away? Why, what in the nation do you mean? I hain't been gone anywheres. Where would I go to?"
Well, looky here, boss. Dey's something wrong, there is. Is I me, or who is I? Is I here, or whar is I? Now that's what I wants to know.
"Well, I think you're here, plain enough, but I think you're a tangle-headed old fool, Jim."
I is I? Well, you answer me this. Didn't you tote out the line in the canoe for to make fast to the towhead?
"No, I didn't. What towhead? I hain't seen no towhead."
You hain't seen no towhead. Looky here. Didn't the line pull loose and the raft go a-hummin' down the river and leave you and the canoe behind in the fog?
"What fog?"
Why, the fog that's been around all night. And didn't you whoop and didn't I whoop till we got mixed up into islands, and one of us got lost and t'other one was just as good as lost, case he didn't know why he was. And didn't I bust up again a lot of them islands and have a turrible time and most get drownded? Now ain't that so, boss? Ain't it so? You answer me that.
Well, this is too many for me, Jim. I hain't seen no fog, nor no islands, nor troubles, nor nothin'. I've been sittin' here talking with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago, and I reckon I done the same. You couldn't have got drunk in that time, so o' course you've been dreamin'.
Dad fetch it, how is I going to dream all dat in 10 minutes?
Well, hang it all. You did dream it, because there didn't any of it happen.
But Huck, it's all just as plain to me as...
It don't make no difference how plain it is. There ain't nothin' in it. I know, because I've been here all the time. Jim didn't say nothin' for about 5 minutes, but sit there studyin' over it. Then he says,
Well, then I reckon I did dream it, Huck. But dog my cats if it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see. And I hain't ever had no dream before that's tired me like this one.
oh well, that's all right, because a dream does tire a body like everything sometimes. But this one was a staving dream. Tell me all about it, Jim. So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. Then he said he must start in and
Turpret.
it, because it was sent for a warning. He said the first towhead stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. The whoops was warnin's that would come to us every now and then, and if we didn't try hard to make out to understand them, they'd just take us into bad luck, 'stead of keeping us out of it. The lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folks. If we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no trouble. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got onto the raft, but it was clearing up again now. Oh well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim, I says, but what does these things stand for? It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft, and the smashed door. You could see them first rate now. Jim looked at the trash, and then looked at me, and back at the trash again. He had got the dream fixed so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose and get the facts back into its place again right away. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steadily without ever smiling, and says,
What did they stand for? I's going to tell you. When I got all wore out wid work and wid the callin' for you and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost and I didn't care no more what become of me and the raft. And when I wake up and find you back again all safe and sound, the tears coming, and I could have got down on my knees and kissed your foot. I was so thankful. And all you was thinking was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. That truck dar is trash. And trash is what people is that puts dirt on the head of their friends and makes them ashamed.
Then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam, and went in there without saying anything, but that was enough. It made me feel so mean I could almost kissed his foot to get him to take it back. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger, but I done it, and I weren't ever sorry for it afterwards neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't 'a' done that one if I'd 'a' known it would make him feel that way. End of chapter 15. Chapter 17 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 17. An Evening Call. The Farm in Arkansas. Interior Decorations. Stephen Doling Bots. Poetical Effusions. In about a minute somebody spoke out of a window without putting his head out and says,
"Be done, boys? Who's there?"
I says, "It's me,
"Who's me?"
George Jackson, sir."
"What do you want?"
"I don't want nothing, sir. I only want to go along by, but the dogs won't let me."
"What are you prowling around here this time of night for, hey?"
"I weren't prowling about, sir. I fell overboard off of the steamboat."
"Oh, you did you? Strike a light there, somebody. What did you say your name was?"
"George Jackson, sir. I'm only a boy."
"Look here. If you're telling the truth, you needn't be afraid. Nobody'll hurt you. But don't try to budge. Stand right where you are. Rouse out Bob and Tom, some of you, and fetch the guns. George Jackson, is there anyone with you?"
"No, sir, nobody. I heard the people stirring about in the house now, and see a light." The man sung out.
"Snatch that light away, Betsy, you old fool. Ain't you got any sense? Put it on the floor behind the door. Bob, if you and Tom are ready, take your places."
"All ready."
"Now, George Jackson, do you know the Shepherdsons?"
"No, sir. I never heard of them."
"Well, that may be so, and it mayn't. Now, all ready? Step forward, George Jackson, and mind, don't you hurry. Come mighty slow. If there's anyone with you, let him keep back. If he shows himself, he'll be shot. Come along now. Come slow. Push the door open yourself. Just enough to squeeze in. D'ye hear?"
I didn't hurry. I couldn't if I'd a wanted to. I took one slow step at a time, and there weren't a sound. Only I thought I couldn't hear my heart. The dogs were as still as the humans, but they followed a little behind me. When I got to the 3 log doorsteps, I heard them unlocking and unbarring and unbolting. I put my hand on the door and pushed it a little and a little more, till somebody said,
"There, that's enough. Put your head in."
I done it, but I judged they would take it off. The candle was on the floor, and there they all was, looking at me, and me at them, for about a quarter of a minute. 3 big men with guns pointed at me, which made me wince, I tell you. The oldest, gray and about 60, the other 2 30 or more, all of them fine and handsome, and the sweetest old gray-headed lady, and back of her 2 young women which I couldn't see right well. The old gentleman says,
"There. I reckon it's all right. Come in."
As soon as I was in, the old gentleman he locked the door and barred it and bolted it, and told the young men to come in with their guns, and they all went in a big parlor that had a new rag carpet on the floor, and got together in a corner that was out of the range of the front windows. There weren't none on the side. They held the candle, and took a good look at me, and all said,
"Why, he ain't a Shepherdson."
"No, there ain't any Shepherdson about him."
Then the old man said he hoped I wouldn't mind being searched for arms, because he didn't mean no harm by it. It was only to make sure. So he didn't pry into my pockets, but only felt outside with his hands, and said it was all right. He told me to take myself easy, and at home, and tell all about myself. But the old lady says,
"Why, bless you, Sol, the poor thing's as wet as he can be, and don't you reckon it may be he's hungry?"
"True for you, Rachel. I forgot."
So the old lady says,
"Betsy,
this was a nigger woman,
you fly round and get him something to eat as quick as you can, poor thing, and one of you girls go and wake up Buck and tell him, oh, here he is himself. Buck, take this little stranger and get the wet clothes off from him and dress him up in something of yours that's dry."
Buck looked about as old as me, 13 or 14 or along there, though he was a little bigger than me. He hadn't on anything but a shirt, and he was very drowsy-headed. He came in, gaping and digging one fist into his eyes, and he was dragging a gun along with the other one. He says,
"Ain't they no Shepherdsons around?"
They said no, 'twas a false alarm.
"Well,
He says,
they'd a been some. I reckon I'd a got one."
They all laughed, and Bob says,
Why, Buck, they might have scalped us all. You've been so slow in coming.
"Well, nobody come after me. 'Nain't right. I'm always kept down. I don't get no show."
Never mind, Buck, my boy.
says the old man.
You'll have show enough, all in good time. Don't you fret about it. Go along with you now, and do as your mother told you.
When we got upstairs to his room, he got me a coarse shirt and a roundabout and pants of his, and I put them on. While I was at it, he asked me what my name was, but before I could tell him, he started to tell me about a blue jay and a young rabbit he had catched in the woods, day before yesterday, and he asked me where Moses was when the candle went out. I said I didn't know. I hadn't heard about it before, no way.
"Well, guess."
He says. How am I going to guess, says I, when I never heard tell of it before?
"But you can guess, can't you? It's just as easy."
Which candle? I says.
"Why, any candle."
He says. I don't know where he was, says I. Where was he?
"Why, he was in the dark. That's where he was."
Well, if you knowed where he was, what did you ask me for?
"Why, blame it. It's a riddle, don't you see? Say, how long are you gonna stay here? You gotta stay always. We can just have booming times. They don't have no school now. Do you own a dog? I've got a dog, and he'll go in the river and bring out chips that you throw in. Do you like to come up on Sundays? And all that kind of foolishness? Bet I don't, but Ma, she makes me. Confound these old breeches. I reckon I better put 'em on, but I'd rather not. It's so warm. Are you all ready? All right, come along, old hoss."
Cold corn pone, cold corned beef, butter and buttermilk. That is what they had for me down there, and there ain't nothing better that ever I've come across yet. Buck and his ma and all of them smoked cob pipes, except the nigger woman, which was gone, and the two young women. They all smoked and talked, and I eat and talked. The young women had quilts about them, and their hair down their backs. They all asked me questions, and I told them how pap and me and all the family was living on a little farm down at the bottom of Arkansas, and my sister Mary Ann run off and got married and never was heard of no more, and Bill went to hunt them and he weren't heard of no more, and Tom and Mort died, and then there weren't nobody but just me and pap left, and he was just trimmed down to nothing on account of his troubles. So when he died I took what there was left, because the farm didn't belong to us, and started up the river deck passage and fell overboard, and that was how I come to be here. So they said I could have a home there as long as I wanted it. Then it was most daylight, and everybody went to bed, and I went to bed with Buck, and when I waked up in the morning, daft it all, I had forgot what my name was. So I laid there about an hour trying to think, and when Buck waked up I says, Can you spell, Buck?
"Yes."
He says, I bet you can't spell my name, says I.
"I bet you what you dare I can."
Says he. All right, says I, go ahead.
Georgejackson. There now.
He says, Well, says I, you done it, but I didn't think you could. It ain't no slouch of a name to spell right off without studying. I set it down, private, because somebody might want me to spell it next, and so I wanted to be handy with it and rattle it off like I was used to it. It was a mighty nice family, and a mighty nice house, too. I hadn't seen no house out in the country before that was so nice, and had so much style. It didn't have an iron latch on the front door, nor a wooden one, but a buckskin string, but a brass knob to turn, the same as houses in town. There weren't no bed in the parlor, nor a sign of a bed. But heaps of parlors in towns has beds in them. There was a big fireplace that was bricked on the bottom, and the bricks was kept clean and red by pouring water on them and scrubbing them with another brick. Sometimes they washed them over with red water paint that they called Spanish brown, same as they do in town. They had big brass dog irons that could hold up a saw log. There was a clock on the middle of the mantelpiece, with a picture of a town painted on the bottom half of the glass front, and a round place in the middle of it for the sun, and you could see the pendulum swinging behind it. It was beautiful to hear that clock tick, and sometimes, when one of these peddlers had been along and scoured her up and got her in good shape, she would start in and strike 150 before she got tuckered out. They wouldn't took any money for her. Well, there was a big outlandish parrot on each side of the clock, which made out something like chalk, and painted up gaudy. By one of the parrots was a cat made of cockery, and a cockery dog by the other, and when you pressed down on them they squeaked, but didn't open their mouths nor look different nor interested. They squeaked through underneath. There was a couple of big wild turkey wing fans spread out behind those things. On the table in the middle of the room was a kind of a lovely cockery basket that had apples and oranges and peaches and grapes piled up in it, which was much redder and yellower and prettier than the real ones is, but they weren't real because you could see where pieces had been chipped off and showed the white chalk, or whatever it was, underneath. This table had a cover made out of a beautiful oilcloth, with a red and blue spread eagle painted on it, and a painted border all around. It come all the way from Philadelphia, they said. There was some books, too, piled up perfectly exact, on each corner of the table. One was a big family Bible full of pictures. One was Pilgrim's Progress, about a man that left his family. It didn't say why. I read considerable in it now and then. The statements was interesting, but tough. Another was Friendship's Offering, full of beautiful stuff and poetry, but I didn't read the poetry. Another was Henry Clay's Speeches, and another was Dr. Gunn's Family Medicine, which told you all about what to do if a body was sick or dead. There was a hymn book, and a lot of other books. And there was nice split-bottom chairs, and perfectly sound, too, not bagged down in the middle and busted, like an old basket. They had pictures hung on the walls, mainly Washingtons and Lafayettes, and battles and Highland Marys, and one called Signing the Declaration. There was some that they called crayons, which one of the daughters which was dead made her own self when she was only 15 years old. They was different from any pictures I ever seen before, blacker mostly. That is common. One was a woman in a slim black dress, belted small under the armpits, with bulges like a cabbage in the middle of the sleeves, and a large black scoop shovel bonnet with a black veil, and white slim ankles crossed about with black tape, and very wee black slippers like a chisel, and she was leaning pensive on a tombstone on her right elbow, under a weeping willow, and her other hand hanging down her side, holding a white handkerchief and a recticle, and underneath the picture it said, "Shall I never see thee more, lass?" Another one was a young lady with her hair all combed up straight to the top of her head, and knotted there in front of a comb, like a chair back, and she was crying into a handkerchief, and had a dead bird laying on its back in her other hand with its heels up, and underneath the picture it said, "I shall never hear thy sweet chirp more, alas." There was one where a young lady was at a window looking up at the moon, and tears running down her cheeks, and she had an open letter in one hand with a black sealing wax showing on one edge of it, and she was mashing a locket with a chain to it against her mouth, and underneath the picture it said, and art thou gone, yes, thou art gone, alas. These were all nice pictures, I reckon, but I didn't somehow seem to take to them, because if ever I was down a little, they always give me the fantods. Everybody was sorry she died, because she had laid out a lot more of these pictures to do, and a body could see by what she had done what they had lost. But I reckon that with her disposition she was having a better time in the graveyard. She was at work on what they said was her greatest picture when she took sick, and every day and every night it was her prayer to be allowed to live till she got it done, but she never got the chance. It was a picture of a young woman in a long white gown, standing on the rail of a bridge all ready to jump off, with her hair all down her back, and looking up to the moon, with the tears running down her face, and she had two arms folded across her breast, and two arms stretched out in front, and two more reaching up towards the moon, and the idea was to see which pair would look best, and then scratch out the other arms. But as I was saying, she died before she got her mind made up, and now they kept this picture over the head of the bed in her room, and every time her birthday come they hung flowers on it. Other times it was hid with a little curtain. The young woman in the picture had a kind of a nice sweet face, but there was so many arms it made her look too spidery, seemed to me. This young girl kept a scrap-book when she was alive, and used to paste obituaries, and accidents, and cases of patient suffering in it, out of the Presbyterian Observer, and write poetry after them out of her own head. It was very good poetry. This is what she wrote about a boy by the name of Stephen Dowling Bots, that fell down a well and was drownded.
Ode to Stephen Dowling Bots, deceased. And did young Stephen sicken, and did young Stephen die, and did the sad hearts thicken, and did the mourners cry? No, such was not the fate of young Stephen Dowling Bots, though sad hearts round him thickened, 'twas not from sickness shots. No whooping cough did rack his frame, nor measles drear with spots. Not these impaired the sacred name of Stephen Dowling Bots. Despised love struck not with woe that head of curly knots, nor stomach troubles laid him low, young Stephen Dowling Bots. Oh no, then list with tearful eye, whilst I his fate do tell. His soul did from this cold world fly by falling down a well. They got him out and emptied him, alas, it was too late! His spirit was gone for to sport aloft in the realms of the good and great.
If Emmeline Granford could make poetry like that before she was 14, there ain't no telling what she could 'a' done by and by. Buck said she could rattle off poetry like nothing. She didn't ever have to stop to think. He said she would slap down a line, and if she couldn't find anything to rhyme with it, would just scratch it out and slap down another one, and go ahead. She weren't particular. She could write about anything you choose to give to her to write about just so it was sadful. Every time a man died, or a woman died, or a child died, she would be on hand with her tribute before he was cold. She called them tributes. The neighbor said it was the doctor first, then Emmeline, then the undertaker. The undertaker never got in ahead of Emmeline but once, and then she hung fire on a rhyme for the dead person's name, which was Whistler. She weren't ever the same after that. She never complained, but she kinder pined away and did not live long. Poor thing, many's the time I made myself go up to the little room that used to be hers, and get out her poor scrap-book, and read in it, when her pictures had been aggravating me, and I had soured on her a little. I liked all that family, dead ones and all, and weren't going to let anything come between us. Poor Emmeline made poetry about all the dead people when she was alive, and it didn't seem right that there weren't nobody to make some about her now she was gone. So I tried to sweat out a verse or two myself, but I couldn't seem to make it go somehow. They kept Emmeline's room trim and nice, and all the things fixed in it just the way she liked to have them when she was alive, and nobody ever slept there. The old lady took care of the room herself, though there was plenty of niggers, and she sewed there a good deal, and read her Bible there mostly. Well, as I was saying about the parlour, there was beautiful curtains on the windows, white with pictures painted on them of castles with vines all down the walls, and cattle coming down to drink. There was a little old piano, too, that had 10 pans in it, I reckon, and nothing was ever so lovely as to hear the young ladies sing "The Last Link is Broken" and play "The Battle of Prague" on it. The walls of all the rooms was plastered, and most had carpets on the floors, and the whole house was whitewashed on the outside. It was a double house, and the big open place betwixt them was roofed and floored, and sometimes the table was set there in the middle of the day, and it was a cool, comfortable place. Nothing couldn't be better, and weren't the cooking good, and just bushels of it too. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 18. Colonel Grangerford. Aristocracy. Feuds. The Testament. Recovering the Raft. The Woodpile. Pork and Cabbage. Colonel Grangerford was a gentleman, you see. He was a gentleman all over, and so was his family. He was well born, as the saying is, and that's worth as much in a man as it is in a horse, so the widow Douglas said, and nobody ever denied that she was of the first aristocracy in our town. And Pop, he always said it too, though he weren't no more quality than a mud-cat himself. Colonel Grangerford was very tall and very slim, and had a darkish paly complexion, not a sign of red in it anywheres. He was clean shaved every morning, all over his thin face, and he had the thinnest kind of lips, and the thinnest kind of nostrils, and a high nose, and heavy eyebrows, and the blackest kind of eyes sunk so deep back that they seemed like they was looking out of caverns at you, as you may say. His forehead was high, and his hair was black and straight and hung to his shoulders. His hands was long and thin, and every day of his life he put on a clean shirt and a full suit from head to foot, made out of linen, so white it hurt your eyes to look at it. And on Sundays he wore a blue-tailed coat with brass buttons on it. He carried a mahogany cane with a silver head to it. There weren't no frivolousness about him, not a bit, and he weren't ever loud. He was as kind as he could be. You could feel that, you know, and so you had confidence. Sometimes he smiled, and it was good to see. But when he straightened himself up like a liberty pole, and the lightning begun to flicker out from under his eyebrows, you wanted to climb a tree first, and find out what the matter was afterwards. He didn't ever have to tell anybody to mind their manners. Everybody was always good-mannered where he was. Everybody loved to have him around, too. He was sunshine most always. I mean, he made it seem like good weather. When he turned into a cloud-bank, it was awful dark for half a minute, and that was enough. There wouldn't nothing go wrong again for a week. When him and the old lady come down in the morning, all the family got up out of their chairs and give them good day, and didn't sit down again till they had sat down. Then Tom and Bob went to the sideboard where the decanter was, and mixed a glass of bitters and handed it to him, and he held it in his hand and waited till Tom's and Bob's was mixed, and then they bowed and said,
Our duty to you, sir and madam.
And they bowed the least bit in the world and said thank you, and so they drank, all three, and Bob and Tom poured a spoonful of water on the sugar, and the mite of whiskey or apple brandy in the bottom of their tumblers, and give it to me and Buck, and we drank to the old people too. Bob was the oldest, and Tom next, tall, beautiful men, with very broad shoulders and brown faces, and long black hair and black eyes. They dressed in white linen from head to foot, like the old gentleman, and wore broad Panama hats. Then there was Miss Charlotte. She was 25, and tall and proud and grand, but as good as she could be when she weren't stirred up. But when she was, she had a look that would make you wilt in your tracks like her father. She was beautiful. So was her sister, Miss Sophia, but it was a different kind. She was gentle and sweet, like a dove, and she was only 20. Each person had their own nigger to wait on them, Buck too. My nigger had a monstrous easy time, because I weren't used to having anybody do anything for me. But Buck's was on the jump most of the time. This was all there was of the family now, but there used to be more. 3 sons, they got killed, and Emmeline that died. The old gentleman owned a lot of farms, and over 100 niggers. Sometimes a stack of people would come there, horseback, from 10 or 15 mile around, and stay 5 or 6 days, and have such junketings around about and on the river, and dances and picnics in the woods daytimes, and the balls at the house nights. These people was mostly kinfolks of the family. The men brought their guns with them. It was a handsome lot of quality, I tell you. There was another clan of aristocracy around there, 5 or 6 families, mostly of the name of Shepherdson. They was as high-toned and well-born and rich and grand as the tribe of Grangerfords. The Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords used the same steamboat landing, which was about 2 mile above our house. So sometimes when I went up there with a lot of our folks, I used to see a lot of the Shepherdsons there on their fine horses. One day Buck and me was away out in the woods hunting, and heard a horse coming. We was crossing the road. Buck says,
Quick, jump for the woods.
we done it, and then peeped down the woods through the leaves. Pretty soon a splendid young man came galloping down the road, setting his horse easy and looking like a soldier. He had his gun across his pommel. I had seen him before. It was young Harney Shepherdson. I heard Buck's gun go off at my ear, and Harney's hat tumbled off of his head. He grabbed his gun and rode straight to the place where we was hid. But we didn't wait. We started through the woods on a run. The woods weren't thick, so I looked over my shoulder to dodge the bullet, and twice I seen Harney cover Buck with his gun, and then he rode away the way he come, to get his hat, I reckon, but I couldn't see. We never stopped running till we got home. The old gentleman's eyes blazed a minute. 'Twas pleasure mainly, I judged. Then his face sort of smoothed down, and he says, kind of gentle,
I don't like that shooting from behind a bush. Why don't you step into the road, my boy?
The Shepherdsons don't, father. They always take advantage.
Miss Charlotte, she had her head up like a queen while Buck was telling his tale, and her nostrils spread and her eyes snapped. The 2 young men looked dark, but never said nothing. Miss Sophia turned pale, but the color come back when she found the man wasn't hurt. Soon as I could get Buck down by the corn cribs under the trees by ourselves, I says, "Did you want to kill him, Buck?"
Well, I bet I did.
"What did he do to you?"
Him? He's never done nothing to me.
"Well, then, what did you want to kill him for?"
Why, nothing. Only it's on the count of the feud.
"What's a feud?"
Why, where was you raised? Don't you know what a feud is?
"Never heard of it before. Tell me about it,"
Well,
says Buck.
a feud is this way. Man has a quarrel with another man and kills him. And that other man's brother kills him. And then the other brothers on both sides goes for one another. Then the cousins chip in. and by everyone's killed off, and there ain't no more feud. But it's kinda slow and takes a long time.
Has this one been going on long, Buck?
Well, I should reckon. It started 30 year ago, or summers along there. There was trouble about something, and then a lawsuit to settle it, and then the suit went again, one of the men, and so he up and shot the man who won the suit, which he would naturally do, of course. Anyone would.
What was the trouble about, Buck? Land?
I reckon maybe. I don't know.
Well, who done the shootin'? Was it a Grangerford or a Shepherdson?
Laws? How do I know? So long ago.
Don't anybody know?
Oh yes, Pa knows, I reckon, and some of the other old people, but they don't know what this row was about in the first place.
Has there been many killed, Buck?
Yes, right smart chance of funerals, but they don't always kill. Pa's got a few buckshot in him, but he don't mind it 'cause he don't weigh much anyway. Pa's been carved up some with a bowie, and Tom's been hurt once or twice.
Has anybody been killed this year, Buck?
Yes, we got one and they got one. About 3 months ago, my cousin Bud, 14-year-old, was riding through the woods on the other side of the river, and didn't have no weapon with him, which was blame foolish. In a lonesome place, he hears a horse coming behind him, and sees old Baldy Shepherdson a linking after him with his gun in his hand and his white hair a flying in the wind. Instead of jumping off and taking to the brush, Bud allowed he could outrun him. So they had it, nip and tuck for 5 mile or more, the old man a gaining all the time. So at last Bud seen it weren't any use, and so he stopped and faced around, so as to have the bullet holes in the front, and the old man he rode up and shot him down, but he didn't get much chance to enjoy his luck, for inside of a week our folks laid him out.
I reckon that old man was a coward, Buck.
I reckon he warn't a coward, not by a blame sight. There ain't a coward amongst them Shepherdsons, not a one, and there ain't no cowards amongst the Grangerfords either. Why, that old man kept up his end in a fight one day for half an hour against 3 Grangerfords. Came out winner. They was all a horse pack, and he lit off his horse and got behind a little wood pile and kept his horse for him to stop the bullets. But the Grangerfords stayed on their horses and capered around the old man, peppered away at him. He peppered away at them. Him and his horse both went home pretty leaky and crippled. The Grangerfords had to be fetched home, and one of them was dead, and the other died the next day. No, sir, the body's out hunting for cowards. He don't want to fool away any time amongst them Shepherdsons, because they don't breed any of that kind.
Next Sunday, we all went to church, about 3 mile, everybody a horseback. The men took their guns along, so did Buck, and kept them between their knees or stood them handy against the wall. The Shepherdsons done the same. It was pretty ornery preachin', all about brotherly love and such like tiresomeness, but everybody said it was a good sermon, and they all talked it over going home, and had such a powerful lot to say about faith and good works and free grace and pre-foreordination, and I don't know what all, but it did seem to me to be one of the roughest Sundays I had run across yet. About an hour after dinner, everybody was dozing around, some in their chairs and some in their rooms, and it got to be pretty dull. Buck and a dog was stretched out on the grass in the sun sound asleep. I went up to our room, and I judged I would take a nap myself. I found that sweet Miss Sophia standing in her door, which was next to ours, and she took me in her room and shut the door very soft, and asked me if I liked her, and I said I did, and she asked me if I would do something for her, and not tell anybody. I said I would. Then she said she'd forget her Testament, and left it in the seat at church between two other books, and would I slip out quiet and go there and fetch it for her, and not say nothing to nobody. I said I would. So I slipped out and slipped off up the road, and there weren't anybody at the church, except maybe a hog or two, for there weren't any lock on the door, and hogs likes a punchin' floor in summertime because it's cool. If you notice, most folks don't go to church only when they've got to, but a hog, it's different. Says I to myself, something's up. It ain't natural for a girl to be in such a sweat about a testament. So I give it a shake, and out drops a little piece of paper, with 2:30 wrote on it with a pencil. I ransacked it, but couldn't find anything else. I couldn't make anything out of that, so I put the paper in the book again, and when I got home and upstairs there was Miss Sophia in her door waiting for me. She pulled me in and shut the door. Then she took in the Testament till she found the paper, and as soon as she read it she looked glad, and before a body could think, she grabbed me and give me a squeeze, and said I was the best boy in the world, and not to tell anybody. She was mighty red in the face for a minute, and her eyes lighted up, and it made her powerful pretty. I was a good deal astonished, but when I got my breath, I asked her what the paper was about, and she asked me if I had read it, and I said no, and she asked me if I could read writing, and I told her no, only coarse hand. And then she said the paper weren't anything but a bookmark to keep her place, and I might go and play now. I went off down to the river, studying over this thing, and pretty soon I noticed that my nigger was following along behind. When he was out of sight of the house, he looked back and around a second, and then comes a running, and says,
Mars Judge, if you'll come down into the swamp, I'll show you a whole stack of water moccasins.
Thinks I, that's mighty curious. He said that yesterday. He oughter know a body don't love water moccasins enough to go around hunting for them. What is he up to anyway? So I says, all right, trot ahead. I followed a half a mile. Then he stuck out over the swamp, and he waded ankle deep as much as another half mile. We come to a little flat piece of land, which was dry and very thick, with trees and bushes and vines, and he says,
You shall right in there just a few steps, Mars Judge. Dar's what dey is. I seed 'em before. I don't care to see 'em no more.
Then he slopped right along and went away, and pretty soon the trees hid him. I poked into the place a ways, and come to a little open patch, as big as a bedroom all hung around with vines, and found a man lying there asleep, and, by jigs, it was my old Jim! I waked him up, and I reckoned it was going to be a grand surprise to him to see me again, but it weren't. He nearly cried, he was so glad, but he weren't surprised. Said he swum along behind me that night, and heard me yell every time, but doesn't answer, because he didn't want nobody to pick him up and take him into slavery again. Says he,
I got hurt a little and couldn't swim fast, so I was a considerable ways behind you, de lass. When you landed, I reckoned I could catch up with you on the land, 'bout having to shout at you, but when I see dat house, I begin to go slow. I is off too fur to hear what they say to you. I was afraid of the dogs, but when I is all quiet again, I knowed you's in the house, so I struck out for the woods and to wait for day. Early in the morning, some of the niggers come along, going to the fields, and they tuck me and showed me this place, while the dogs can't track me on accounts of the water, and they brings me truck to eat every night and tells me how you's getting along.
why didn't you tell my Jack to fetch me here sooner, Jim?
Well, 'twa'n't no use to disturb you, Huck, till we could do something, but we's all right now. I've been a-buying pots and pans and victuals, as I got a chancet, and a-patching up the raft nights when—
What raft, Jim?
Our old raft.
You mean to say our old raft weren't smashed all to flinders?
No, she wa'n't. She were tore up a good deal. One end of her was, But there wa'n't no great harm done, only our traps was most all lost. If we hadn't dived so deep and swum so fur under water, and the night hadn't been so dark, and we wa'n't so scared, and been such pumpkin heads, as the sayin' is, we'd a seed the raft. But it's just as well we didn't, 'case now she's all fixed up again, most as good as new, and we's got a new lot of stuff in the place of what was lost.
Why, how did you get hold of the raft again, Jim? Did you catch her?
How I goin' to catch her, and I out in the woods? No, some of the niggers found her, catched on a snag along here in the bend, and they hid her in a crick 'mongst the willers, and they was so much jawin' 'bout which un she belonged to the most that I come to hear about it purty soon. So I ups and settles the trouble by tellin' 'em she don't belong to none of 'em but to you and me. And I asked 'em if they goin' to grab a young white gentleman's property and git a hidin' for it. Then I gin 'em 10 cents apiece, and they is purty well satisfied, and wished some more rafts 'd come along and make 'em rich again. They's mighty good to me, decent niggers is. Whatever I wants 'em to do for me, I don't have to ask 'em twice, honey. Dat Jack's a good nigger, and purty smart.
Yes, he is. He ain't ever told me you was here. Told me to come, and how'd he'd show me a lot of water moccasins. If anything happens, he ain't mixed up in it. He can say he never seen us together, and it'll be the truth. I don't want to talk much about the next day. I reckoned I'll cut it pretty short. I waked up about dawn, and was a-goin' to turn over and go to sleep again when I noticed how still it was. Didn't seem to be anybody stirring. That weren't usual. Next, I noticed that Buck was up and gone. Well, I gets up, a-wondering, and goes downstairs. Nobody around. Everything was still as a mouse. Just the same outside. Thinks I, what does it mean? Down by the woodpile I comes across my Jack and says, "What's all it about?" Says he,
"Don't you know, Mars Judge?"
"No," says I don't."
"Well, then, Miss Sophia's run off, 'deed she has. She run off in de night, sometime, nobody don't know jes when. Run off to git married to dat young Harney Shepherdson, you know. Leastways, so dey spec. De fambly found out 'bout half an hour ago, maybe a little more, and I tell you dey warn't no time lost. Sich another hurryin' up guns and hosses you never see. De women folks has gone for to stir up de relations, and ole Miss Saul and de boys tuck dey guns and rode up de river road for to try to ketch dat young man and kill him 'fore he can get across de river with Miss Sophia. I reck they gwine to be mighty rough times."
Buck went off without waking me up.
"Well, I reck they did. They don't gwine to mix you up in it. Mars Buck he loaded up his gun and 'lowed he's gwine to fetch home a Shepherdson or bust. Well, there'll be plenty of 'em thar, I reckon, and you bet he'll fetch one ef he gets a chancet."
I took up the river road as hard as I could put. By and by I began to hear guns a good ways off. When I come in sight of the log store and the wood pile where the steamboats lands, I worked along under the trees and brush till I got to a good place, and then I clumb up into the forks of a cottonwood that was out of reach and watched. There was a wood rank 4 foot high a little ways in front of the tree, and first I was going to hide behind that, but maybe it was luckier I didn't. There was 4 or 5 men cavorting around on their horses in the open place before the log store, cussing and yelling, and trying to get at a couple of young chaps that was behind the wood rank alongside of the steamboat landing. But they couldn't come it. Every time one of them showed himself on the riverside of the wood-pile he got shot at. The two boys was squatting back to back behind the wood-pile, so they could watch both ways. By and by the men stopped cavorting around and yelling. They started riding towards the store. Then up gets one of the boys, draws a steady bead over the wood rank, and drops one of them out of his saddle. All of the men jump off their horses and grab the hurt one and started to carry him to the store, and that minute the two boys started to run. They got halfway to the tree I was in before the men noticed. Then the men see them and jumped on their horses and took off after them. They gained on the boys, but it didn't do no good. The boys had too good a start. They got to the wood-pile that was in front of my tree and slipped in behind it, and so they had the bulge on the men again. One of the boys was Buck, and the other was a slim young chap about 19 years old. The men ripped around a while and then rode away. As soon as they was out of sight I sung out to Buck and told him. He didn't know what to make of my voice coming out of the tree at first. He was awful surprised. He told me to watch out sharp and let him know when the men comes in sight again. Said they was up to some devilment or another. Wouldn't be gone long. I wished I was out of that tree, but I doesn't come down. Buck began to cry and rip, and lowed that him and his cousin Joe, that was the other young chap, would make up for this day yet. He said his father and his two brothers was killed, and 2 or 3 of the enemy. Said the Shepherdsons laid for them in ambush. Buck said his father and brothers ought to be waited for their relations. The Shepherdsons was too strong for them. I asked him what was become of young Harney and Miss Sophia. They said they got across the river and was safe. I was glad of that, but the way Buck did take on, because he didn't manage to kill Harney that day he shot at him, I ain't ever heard anything like it. All of a sudden, bang, 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 goes 3 or 4 guns. The men had slipped around through the woods and come in from behind without their horses. The boys jumped for the river, both of them hurt, and as they swum down the current the men run along the bank, shooting at them and singing out,
Kill them! Kill them!
It made me so sick I most fell out of a tree. I ain't a-going to tell all that happened. It would make me sick again if I was to do that. I wished I hadn't ever come ashore that night to see such things. I ain't ever going to get shut of them. Lots of times I dreamed about them. I stayed in the tree till it began to get dark, afraid to come down. Sometimes I heard guns away off in the woods, and twice I seen little gangs of men gallop past the log store with guns, so I reckon the trouble was still a-going on. I was mighty downhearted, so I made up my mind I wouldn't ever go a-near that house again, because I reckoned I was to blame, somehow. I judged that that piece of paper meant that Miss Sophia was to meet Harney somewheres at 2:30 and run off, and I judged I ought to told her father about that paper, and the curious way she acted, and then maybe he would a-locked her up, and this awful mess wouldn't ever happened. When I got down out of the tree, I crept along down the river bank a piece, and found the 2 bodies laying in the edge of the water, and tugged at them till I got them ashore. Then I covered up their faces, and got away as quick as I could. I cried a little when I was covering up Buck's face, for he was mighty good to me. It was just dark now. I never went near the house, but struck through the woods and made for the swamp. Jim warn't on his island, so I tramped off in a hurry for the crick, and crowded through the willows, red hot to jump aboard and get out of that awful country. The raft was gone, my souls, but I was scared. I couldn't get my breath for most a minute, then I raised a yell. A voice not 25 foot from me says,
"Good land, is that you, honey? Don't make no noise."
It was Jim's voice. Nothing ever sounded so good before. I run along the bank a piece and got aboard, and Jim, he grabbed me and hugged me. He was so glad to see me. He says,
Laws bless you, child. I's right down sure you's dead again. Jack's been here. He say he's reckon you's been shot, case you didn't come home no more. So I's just dis minute a startin' to raft down toward de mouth of de crick, so's to be all ready for to shove out and leave soon as Jack comes again and tells me for certain you is dead. Lawsy, I's mighty glad to get you back again, honey.
I says, all right, that's mighty good. They won't find me, and they'll think I've been killed and floated down the river. There's something up there that'll help them think so. So don't you lose no time, Jim, but just shove off for the big water as fast as ever you can. I never felt easy till the raft was 2 miles below there and out in the middle of the Mississippi. Then we hung up our signal lantern and judged that we was free and safe once more. I hadn't had a bite to eat since yesterday, so Jim, he got out some corn dodgers and buttermilk, and pork and cabbage and greens. There ain't nothing in the world so good when it's cooked right, and whilst I eat my supper, we talked and had a good time. I was powerful glad to get away from the feuds, and so was Jim to get away from the swamp. He said there weren't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 19. Tying Up Daytimes. An Astronomical Theory. Running a Temperance Revival. The Duke of Bridgewater. The Troubles of Royalty. 2 or 3 days and nights went by. I reckoned I might say they swum by. They slid along so quiet and smooth and lovely. Here is the way we put in the time. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We run nights, and laid up and hid daytimes. Soon as night was most gone, we stopped navigating and tied up, nearly always in the dead water under a towhead, and then cut young cottonwoods and willows, and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the lines. Next we slid into the river and had a swim, so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom, where the water was about knee deep, and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywheres, perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep, only sometimes the bullfrogs a-cluttering maybe. The first thing to see, looking away over the water, was a kind of dull line. That was the woods on t'other side. You couldn't make nothing else out. Then a pale place in the sky. Then more paleness spreading around. Then the river softened up a way off, and weren't black any more, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows, and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you could hear a sweep squeaking, or jumbled up voices, it was so still. And sounds come so far, and by you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there's a snag there in the swift current, which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And if you see the mist curl up off the water, and the east reddens up, and the river, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods, away on the bank on t'other side of the river, being a woodyard, likely, and piled by them cheats, so you can throw a dog through it anywheres. Then the nice breeze springs up, and comes fanning you from over there, so cool and fresh and sweet to smell on account of the woods and the flowers, but sometimes not that way, because they've left dead fish lying around. gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. And next you've got this full day, and everything smiling in the sun, and the songbirds just going it. A little smoke couldn't be noticed now, so we would take some fish off of the lines and cook up a hot breakfast. And afterwards we would watch the lonesomeness of the river and kind of lazy along, and by lazy off to sleep. Wake up by and look to see what done it, and maybe see a steamboat coughing along upstream, so far as toward the other side you couldn't tell nothing about her only whether she was a stern wheel or a side wheel. Then for about an hour there wouldn't be nothing to hear nor nothing to see, just solid lonesomeness. Next you'd see your raft sliding by, away off yonder, and maybe a galoot on it chopping, because they're most always doing it on the raft. You see the axe flash and come down. You don't hear nothing. You see that axe go up again, and by the time it's above a man's head, then you hear the clunk. It had took all that time to come over the water. So we would put in the day, lazying around, listening to the stillness. Once there was a thick fog, and the rafts and things that went by was beating tin pans so the steamboats wouldn't run over them. A scow or a raft went by so close we could hear them talking and cussing and laughing, heard them plain, but we couldn't see no sign of them. It made you feel crawly. It was like spirits carrying on that way in the air. Jim said he believed it was spirits, but I says, no, spirits wouldn't say, durn the durn fog. Soon as it was night out we shoved. When we got her out to about the middle we let her alone, and let her float wherever the current wanted her to. Then we lit the pipes, and dangled our legs in the water, and talked about all kinds of things. We was always naked, day and night, whenever the mosquitoes would let us. The new clothes Buck's folks made for me was too good to be comfortable, and besides, I didn't go much on clothes nohow. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, and maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window, and sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two on a raft or a scow, you know, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there, all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them, and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim, he allowed they was made, but I allowed they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could a laid them. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I've seen a frog lay most as many. So of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, and see them streak down. Jim allowed they'd got spoiled and was hove out of the nest. Once or twice of a night we would see a steamboat slipping along in the dark, and now and then she would belch a whole world of sparks up out of her chimblies, and they would rain down in the river and look awful pretty. Then she would turn a corner, and her lights would wink out, and her powwow shut off, and leave the river still again. And by her waves would get to us a long time after she was gone, and joggle a raft a bit, and after that you wouldn't hear nothing, for you couldn't tell how long, except maybe frogs or something. After midnight the people on shore went to bed, and then for 2 or 3 hours the shores was black. No more sparks in the cabin windows. These sparks was our clock. The first one that showed again meant morning was coming. So we hunted a place to hide and tie up right away. One morning, about daybreak, I found a canoe and crossed over a chute to the main shore. It was only 200 yards, and paddled about a mile up a creek amongst the cypress woods to see if I couldn't get some berries. Just as I was passing a place where a kind of a cow path crossed the crick, here comes a couple of men tearing up the path as tight as they could foot it. I thought I was a goner, for whenever anybody was after anybody, I judged it was me, or maybe Jim. I was about to dig out from there in a hurry, but they was pretty close to me then, and sung out and begged me to save their lives, said they hadn't been doing nothing, and was being chased for it, said there was men and dogs a-comin', they wanted to jump right in, but I says, "Don't you do it! I don't hear the dogs and horses yet. You've got time to crowd through the brush, and get up the crick a little ways. Then you take to the water, and wade down to me and get in. That'll throw the dogs off the scent." They done it, and soon as they was aboard, I let out for our towhead, and in about 5 or 10 minutes we heard the dogs, and the men away off shouting. We heard them come along toward the crick, but couldn't see them. They seemed to stop and fool around a while. Then as we got further and further away all the time, we couldn't hardly hear them at all. By the time we had left the mile of the woods behind us and struck the river, everything was quiet, and we paddled over to the towhead and hid in the cottonwoods and was safe. One of these fellows was about 70 or upwards, and had a bald head and very gray whiskers. He had an old battered up slouch hat on, and a greasy blue woolen shirt, and ragged old blue jeans breeches stuffed into his boot tops, and home knit galooshes. No, he only had one. He had an old long tailed blue jeans coat, with slick brass buttons flung over his arm, and both of them had big fat ratty looking carpet bags. The other fellow was about 30, and dressed about as ornery. After breakfast we all laid off and talked, and the first thing that comes out was that these chaps didn't know one another.
"What got you into trouble?"
Says the bald-headed to t'other chap.
"Well, I'd been selling an article to take the tartar off the teeth, and it does take it off too, and generally the enamel along with it. But I stayed about one night longer than I ought to, and was just in the act of sliding out when I ran across you on the trail this side of town, and you told me they were coming, and begged me to help you to get off. So I told you I was expecting trouble myself, and would scatter out with you. That's the whole yarn. What's yourn?"
"Well, I'd been running a little temperance revival there about a week, and was the pet of the women folk, big and little, for I was making it mighty warm for the rummies, I tell you, and taking as much as $5 or $6 a night, 10 cents a head, children and niggers free, and business a-growing all the time, when somehow or another a little report got around last night that I had a way of putting in my time with a private jug on the sly. A nigger rousted me out this morning, and told me the people was gathering on the quiet with their dogs and horses, and they'd be along pretty soon, and give me about half-hour's start, and then run me down if they could. And if they got me, they'd tar and feather me, and ride me out on a rail, sure. I didn't wait for no breakfast. I weren't hungry."
"Old man,"
said the young one,
"I reckon we might double team it together. What do you think?"
"I ain't undisposed. What's your line, mainly?"
"You're a printer by trade. Do a little in patent medicines, theatre actor, tragedy. You know, take a turn to mesmerism and phrenology when there's a chance. Teach singing geography school for a change. Sling a lecture sometimes. Oh, I do lots of things. Most anything that comes handy. So it ain't work. What's your lay?"
"I've done considerable in the doctoring way in my time. Laying on o' hands is my best holt for cancer and paralysis and such things, and I can tell you a fortune pretty good when I've got someone along to find out the facts for me. Preaching's my line too, and working camp meetings and missionarying around."
Nobody ever said anything for a while. Then the young man hove a sigh and says,
"Alas."
"What are you a-lassin about?"
says the bald head.
To think I should have lived to be leading such a life, and be degraded down into such company.
And he begun to wipe the corner of his eye with a rag.
Durn your skin. Ain't the company good enough for you?
Says the bald head, pretty pert and uppish.
Yes, it is good enough for me. It's as good as I deserve. For who fetched me so low when I was so high? I did myself. I don't blame you, gentlemen, far from it. I don't blame anybody. I deserve it all. Let the cold world do its worst. One thing I know, there's a grave somewhere for me. The world may go on just as it's always done, and take everything from me. Loved ones, property, everything. But it can't take that. Some day I'll lie down in it and forget it all, and my poor broken heart will be at rest.
He went on a wiping.
Drop your poor broken heart,
says the bald head.
What are you heaving your poor broken heart at us for? We hain't done nothin'.
No, I know you haven't. I ain't blaming you, gentlemen. I brought myself down. Yes, I did it myself. It's right I should suffer. Perfectly right. I don't make any moan.
Brought you down from war? Where was you brought down from?
You would not believe me. The world never believes. Let it pass. 'Tis no matter. The secret of my birth.
The secret of your birth? Do you mean to say?
Gentlemen,
says the young man, very solemn,
I will reveal it to you, for I feel I may have confidence in you. By rights, I am a duke.
Jim's eyes bugged out when he heard that, and I reckon mine did too. Then the bald head says,
No, you can't mean it.
Yes, my great-grandfather, eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater, fled to this country about the end of the last century to breathe the pure air of freedom, married here, and died, leaving a son, his own father dying about the same time. The second son of the late Duke seized the titles and estates. The infant real Duke was ignored. I am the lineal descendant of that infant. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater, and here am I, forlorn, torn from my high estate, hunted of men, despised by the cold world, ragged, worn, heartbroken, and degraded to the companionship of felons on a raft.
Jim pitied him ever so much, and so did I. We tried to comfort him, but he said it weren't much use. He couldn't be much comforted. Said if we was a mind to acknowledge him, that would do him more good than most anything else. So we said we would, if he would tell us how. He said we ought to bow when we spoke to him and say, Your Grace, or My Lord, or Your Lordship. And he wouldn't mind if we called him plain Bridgewater, which he said was a title anyway, and not a name, and one of us ought to wait on him at dinner, and do any little thing for him he wanted done. Well, that was all easy, so we done it. All through dinner, Jim stood around and waited on him, and says,
Will your grace have some of this, or some of that?
And so on, and a body could see it was mighty pleasing to him. But the old man got pretty silent by and by, didn't have much to say, and didn't look pretty comfortable over all that petting that was going on around that Duke. He seemed to have something on his mind. So, along in the afternoon, he says,
Looky here, Bilgewater,
he says,
I'm nation sorry for you, but you ain't the only person that's had troubles like that.
No?
No, you ain't. You ain't the only person that's been snaked down wrongfully out in a high place.
Alas.
No, you ain't the only person that's had a secret of his birth.
And by jigs, he begins to cry.
Hold! What do you mean?
Bilgewater, can I trust you?
Says the old man, still sort of sobbing.
To the bitter death.
He took the old man by the hand and squeezed it, and says,
That secret of your being, speak.
Bilgewater, I am the late Dalphin.
I bet you Jim and me stared this time. Then the Duke says,
You are what?
Yes, my friends, it is true. Your eyes are looking at the very moment on the poor disappeared Dauphin, Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette.
You? At your age? No. You mean you're the late Charlemagne. You must be 600 or 700 years old, at the very least.
Trouble has done it, Bilgewater. Trouble has done it. Trouble has brung the grey hairs and this premature balditude. Yes, gentlemen, you see before you, in blue jeans and misery, the wandering, exiled, trampled upon, and suffering wrathful king of France.
Well, he cried, and took on so that me and Jim didn't know hardly what to do. We was so sorry, and so glad and proud we'd got him with us too. So we set in, like we done before with the Duke, and tried to comfort him, but he said it weren't no use. Nothing but to be dead and done with it all could do him any good, though he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while if people treated him according to his rights, and got down on one knee to speak to him, and always called him Your Majesty, and waited on him first at meals, and didn't set down in his presence till he asked them. So Jim and me set to majestying him, and doing this and that and t'other for him, and standing up till he told us we might sit down. This done him heaps of good, and so he got cheerful and comfortable, but the Duke kind of scoured on him, and didn't look a bit satisfied with the way things was going. Still, the king acted real friendly toward him, and said the Duke's great-grandfather and all the other dukes of Bilgewater was a good deal thought of by his father, and was allowed to come to the palace considerable, but the Duke stayed huffy a good while, till by and by the king says,
Like as not we got to be together a blamed long time on this raft, Bilgewater, and so what's the use o' you being so sour? It'll only make things uncomfortable. It ain't my fault I weren't born a duke. It ain't your fault you weren't born a king. So what's the use to worry? Make the best of things the way you find 'em, says I. That's my motto. This ain't no bad thing that we've struck here. Plenty grub and an easy life. Come, give us your hand, Duke, and let's all be friends.
The Duke done it, and Jim and me was pretty glad to see it. It took away all the uncomfortableness, and we felt mighty good over it, because it would have been a miserable business to have any unfriendliness on the raft, for what you want, above all things, on a raft, is for everybody to be satisfied, and feel right and kind towards the others. It didn't take me long to make up my mind that these liars weren't no kings nor dukes at all, but just low-down humbugs and frauds. But I never said nothing, never let on, kept it to myself. It's the best way, then you don't have no quarrels, and don't get into no trouble. If they wanted us to call them kings and dukes, I hadn't no objections, long as it would keep peace in the family, and it weren't no use to tell Jim, so I didn't tell him. If I never learnt nothing else out of pap, I learned that the best way to get along with this kind of people is to let them have their own way. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 20. Huck Explains. Laying out a campaign. Working the camp meeting. A pirate at the camp meeting. The Duke as a printer. They asked us considerable many questions. Wanted to know what we covered up the raft that way for, and laid by in the daytime instead of running. Was Jim a runaway nigger? Says I, goodness sakes, would a runaway nigger run south? No, they allowed he wouldn't. I had to account for things some way, So I says, my folks was living in Pike County, in Missouri, when I was born, and they all died off, but me and Pa and my brother Ike. Pa, he'd break up and go down and live with Uncle Ben, who's got a little one-horse place on the river 4 mile below Orleans. Pa was pretty poor and had some debts, but when he squared up there weren't nothing left but $16 and our nigger Jim. That weren't enough to take us 1,400 mile, deck passage nor other way. Well, when the river rose, Pa had a streak of luck one day. He ketched this piece of a raft, so we reckoned we'd go down to Orleans on it. Pa's luck didn't hold out. The steamboat run over the for'ard corner of the raft one night, and we all went overboard and dove under the wheel. Jim and me come up all right, but Pa was drunk, and Ike was only 4 years old, so they never come up no more. Well, for the next day or two we had considerable trouble, because people was always coming out in skiffs and trying to take Jim away from me, saying they believed he was a runaway nigger. We don't run daytimes no more now. Nights, they don't bother us. The Duke says,
Leave me alone to cipher out a way so we can run in the daytime if we want to. I'll think the thing over. I'll invent a plan that'll fix it. We'll let it alone for today because of course we don't want to go by that town yonder in daylight. It mightn't be healthy.
Towards night, it begun to darken up and look like rain. The heat lightning was squirting around low down in the sky, and the leaves was beginning to shiver. It was going to be pretty ugly. It was easy to see that. So the Duke and the King went to overhauling our wigwam to see what the beds was like. My bed was a straw tick, better than Jim's, which was a corn shuck tick. There's always cobs around about in the shuck tick, and they poke into you and hurt, and when you roll over, the dry shucks sound like you was rolling over a pile of dead leaves. It makes such a rustling that you wake up. Well, the Duke allowed he would take my bed, but the King allowed he wouldn't. He says,
I should have reckoned the difference in rank would have suggested to you that a corn-shuck bed weren't just fittin' for me to sleep in. Your Grace'll take the shuck bed himself.
Jim and me was in a sweat again for a minute, being afraid there was going to be some more trouble among them. So we was pretty glad when the Duke says,
"'Tis my fate to be always ground into the mire under the iron heel of oppression. Misfortune has broken my once haughty spirit. I yield, I submit. 'Tis my fate. I am alone in the world. Let me suffer. Can bear it."
We got away as soon as it was good and dark. The King told us to stand well out towards the middle of the river, and not show a light till we got a long ways below the town. We come in sight of the little bunch of lights by and by. That was the town, you know, and slide by, about a half a mile out, all right. When we was 3/4 of a mile below, we hoisted up our signal lantern, and about 10 o'clock it come on to rain and blow and thunder and lightning like everything. So the King told us to both stay on watch till the weather got better. Then him and the Duke crawled into the wigwam and turned in for the night. It was my watch below till 12, but I wouldn't a turned in anyway if I had a bed, because a body don't see such a storm as that every day in the week, not by a long sight. My souls, how the wind did scream along, and every second or two there'd come a glare that lit up the whitecaps for about a mile around, and you'd see the islands looking dusty through the rain, and the trees thrashing around in the wind. Then comes a whack, bum bum, bumble umble bum 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 bum, and the thunder would go a rumbling and grumbling away, and quit, and then rip comes another flash, and another sucked-oliger. The waves most washed me off the raft sometimes, but I hadn't any clothes on, and didn't mind. We didn't have no trouble about snags. The lightning was glaring, and flittering around so constant that we could see them plenty soon enough to throw her head this way or that and miss them. I had the middle watch, you know, but I was pretty sleepy by that time, so Jim said he would stand the first half for it for me. He was always mighty good that way, Jim was. I crawled into the wigwam, but the king and the duke had their legs sprawled out, so there weren't no show for me. So I laid outside. I didn't mind the rain, because it was warm, and the waves weren't running so high now. About 2 they come up again, though, and Jim was going to call me, but he changed his mind, because he reckoned they weren't high enough to get to do any harm. But he was mistaken about that, for pretty soon, all of a sudden, along comes a regular ripper, and watched me overboard. It most killed Jim a-laughing. He was the easiest nigger to laugh that ever was, anyway. I took the watch, and Jim he laid down and snored away, and by the storm let up for good and all, and the first cabin light that showed, I roused him out, and we slid the raft into hiding quarters for the day. The king got out a ratty old deck of cards after breakfast, and him and the duke played 7-up a while, 5 cents a game. Then they got tired of it, and allowed they would lay out the campaign, as they called it. The duke went down into his carpet-bag, and fetched up a lot of little printed bills, and read them out loud. One bill said, "The celebrated Dr. Armand de Montalban, of Paris, would lecture on the science of phrenology at such and such a place, on the blank day of blank, at 10 cents admission, and furnish charts of character at 25 cents apiece." The duke said that was him. In another bill he was the world-renowned Shakespearean tragedian, Garrick the Younger, or Drury Lane, London. In other bills he had a lot of other names, and done other wonderful things, like finding water and gold with a divining rod, dissipating witch spells, and so on. By and by he says,
"But the historic muse is the darling. Have you ever trod the boards, royalty?"
No,
says the king.
"You shall, then, before you're 3 days older, fallen grandeur,"
says the duke.
"The first good town we come to, we'll hire a hall, and do the sword fight in Richard III, and the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. How does that strike you?"
I'm in, up to the hub, for anything that will pay, Bilgewater. But, you see, I don't know nothing about playin' actin', and hain't ever seen much of it. I was too small when Pap used to have 'em at the palace. Do you reckon you can learn me?
"Easy."
All right. I'm just a freezin' for something fresh, anyway. Let's commence right away.
So the duke he told him all about who Romeo was, and who Juliet was, and said he was used to being Romeo, so the king could be Juliet.
But if Juliet's such a young gal, Duke, my peeled head and my white whiskers is going to look uncommon odd on her, maybe.
"No, don't you worry. These country jakes won't ever think of that. Besides, you know, you'll be in costume, and that makes all the difference in the world. Juliet's in a balcony, enjoying the moonlight before she goes to bed, and she's got on her nightgown and her ruffled nightcap. Here are the costumes for the parts."
He got out 2 or 3 curtain calico suits, which he said was medieval armor for Richard III, and t'other chap, and a long white cotton nightshirt and a ruffled nightcap to match. The king was satisfied, so the duke got out his book and read the parts over in the most splendid spread-eagle way, prancing around and acting at the same time, to show how it had got to be done. Then he give the book to the king and told him to get his part by heart. There was a little one-horse town about 3 mile down the bend, and after dinner the duke said he had ciphered out his idea about how to run in daylight without being dangerousome for Jim. So he allowed he would go down to town and fix that thing. The king allowed he would go too, and see if he couldn't strike something. We was out of coffee, so Jim said I'd better go along with them, in the canoe and get some. When we got there weren't nobody stirring, streets empty, and perfectly dead and still, like Sunday. We found a sick nigger sunning himself in a backyard, and he said everybody that weren't too young or too sick or too old was gone to camp meeting about 2 mile back in the woods. The king got the directions, and allowed he'd go and work that camp meeting for all it was worth, and I might go too. The Duke said what he was after was a printing office. We found it, a little bit of a concern, up over a carpenter shop. Carpenters and printers all gone to the meeting, and no doors locked. It was a dirty, littered up place, and had ink marks and handbills with pictures of horses and runaway niggers on them all over the walls. The Duke shed his coat, and said he was all right now, so me and the king lit out for the camp meeting. We got there in about a half an hour fairly dripping, for it was most awful hot day. There was as much as 1,000 people there from 20 mile around. The woods was full of teams and wagons hitched everywheres, feeding out of the wagon troughs and stopping to keep off the flies. There was sheds made out of poles and roofed over with branches, where they had lemonade and gingerbread to sell, and piles of watermelons and green corn and such like truck. The preaching was going on under the same kinds of sheds, only they was bigger and held crowds of people. The benches was made out of a outside slab of logs, with holes bored in the round side to drive sticks into 4 legs. They didn't have no backs. The preachers had high platforms to stand on at one end of the sheds. The women had on sunbonnets, and some had linsey woolly frocks, some gingham ones, and a few of the young ones had on calico. Some of the young men was barefooted, and some of the children didn't have on any clothes, but just a tow linen shirt. Some of the old women was knitting, and some of the young folks was courting on the sly. The first shed we come to, the preacher was lining out a hymn. He lined out 2 lines. Everybody sung it, and it was kind of grand to hear it. There was so many of them, and they done it in such a rousing way. Then he lined out 2 more of them to sing, and so on. The people woke up more and more, and sung louder and louder. And towards the end, some began to groan, and some began to shout. Then the preacher began to preach, and begun in earnest too, and went weaving first to one side of the platform, and then on the other, and then a-leaning down over the front of it, with his arms and his body going all the time, and shouting his words out with all his might. And every now and then he would hold up his Bible, and spread it open, and kind of pass it around this way and that, shouting,
"It's the brazen serpent in the wilderness. Look upon it and live."
And people would shout out,
"Glory! Amen!"
And so he went on, and the people groaning and crying and saying amen.
Oh, come to the mourner's bench. Come black with sin.
Amen!
Come sick and sore.
Amen!
Come lame and halt and blind.
Amen!
Come poor and needy, sunk in shame.
Amen!
Come all that's worn and soiled in suffering. Come with a broken spirit. Come with a contrite heart. Come in your rags and sin and dirt. The waters that cleanse is free. The door of heaven stands open. Oh, enter and be at rest.
Amen! Glory! Glory! Hallelujah!
And so on. You couldn't make out what the preacher said any more, on account of the shouting and crying. Folks got up everywheres in the crowd, and worked their way just by main strength to the mourners' bench, with the tears running down their faces, and when all the mourners had got up there to the front benches in the crowd, they sung and shouted and flung themselves down on the straw, just crazy and wild. Well, the first I knowed, the king got a-going, and you could hear him over everybody, and next he went a-charging up onto the platform, and the preacher He begged him to speak to the people, and he done it. He told them he was a pirate, been a pirate for 30 years out in the Indian Ocean, and his crew was thinned out considerable last spring in a fight, and he was home now to take out some fresh men, and thanks to goodness, he'd been robbed last night and put ashore off of a steamboat without a cent, and he was glad of it. It was the blessedest thing that ever happened to him, because he was a changed man now, and happy for the first time in his life, and poor as he was going to start right off and work his way back to the Indian Ocean, and put the rest of his life trying to turn the pirates into the true path. For he could do it better than anybody else, being acquainted with all pirate crews in that ocean, and though it would take him a long time to get there without money, he would get there anyway. And every time he convinced a pirate, he would say to him,
"Don't you thank me. Don't you give me no credit. It all belongs to them dear people in Pokeville camp meeting, natural brothers and benefactors of the race, and that dear preacher there, the truest friend a pirate ever had."
And then he busted into tears, and so did everybody. Then somebody sings out,
"Take up a collection for him! Take up a collection!"
Well, a half a dozen made up a jump to do it, but somebody sings out,
"Let him pass the hat around."
Then everybody said it, the preacher too. So the king went all through the crowd with his hat swabbing his eyes, and blessing the peoples and praising them and thanking them for being so good to the poor pirates away off there. And every little while the prettiest kind of girls, with the tears running down their cheeks, would up and ask him would he let them kiss him for to remember him by, and he always done it, and some of them he hugged and kissed as many as 5 or 6 times. And he was invited to stay a week, and everybody wanted him to live in their houses, and said they'd think it was an honor. But he said, as this was the last day of the camp meeting, he couldn't do no good, and besides, he was in a sweat to get on to the Indian Ocean right off, and go to work on the pirates. When we got back to the raft, and he come to count up, he found he had collected $87.75, and then he had fetched away a 3-gallon jug of whiskey too, that he found under a wagon when he was starting home through the woods. The king said take it all around. It laid over any day he'd ever put in the missionarying line. He said it weren't no use talking. Heathens don't amount to shucks, alongside of pirates to work a camp meeting with. The Duke was thinking he'd been doing pretty well till the king come to show up, but after that he didn't think so much. He had set up and printed off 2 little jobs for farmers in that printing office, horse bills, and took the money, $4, and he had got and $10 worth of advertisements for the paper, which he said he would put in for $4 if they would pay in advance, so they done it. The price of the paper was $2 a year, but he took in 3 subscriptions for half $1 apiece on condition of them paying him in advance. They were going to pay in cordwood and onions as usual, but he said he had just bought the concern and knocked down the price as low as he could afford it, and was going to run it for cash. He set up a little piece of poetry which he made himself out of his own head, 3 verses, kind of sweet and saddish. The name of it was, yes, Crush Cold World, This Breaking Heart, and he left that all set up and ready to print in the paper, and didn't charge nothing for it. Well, he took in $9.50, and said he'd done a pretty square day's work for it. Then he showed us another little job he printed, and hadn't charged for, because it was for us. It had a picture of a runaway nigger, with a bundle on a stick over his shoulder, and $200 reward under it. The reading was all about Jim, and just described him to a dot. It said he run away from St. Jacques plantation, 40 mile below New Orleans, last winter, and likely went north, and whoever would catch him and send him back, he could have the reward and expenses.
Now,
says the Duke,
after tonight, we can run in the daytime if we want to. Whenever we see anybody coming, we can tie Jim hand and foot with a rope and lay him in the wigwam and show this handbill and say we captured him up the river and we're too poor to travel on a steamboat, so we got this little raft on credit from our friends and are going down to get the reward. Handcuffs and chains would look still better on Jim, but it wouldn't go well with the story of us being so poor. Too much like jewelry. Ropes are the correct thing. We must preserve the unities, as we say on the boards.
We all said the Duke was pretty smart, and there couldn't be no trouble about running daytimes. We judged we could make miles enough that night to get out of the reach of the powwow. We reckoned that the Duke's work in the printing office was going to make in that little town. Then we could boom right along if we wanted to. We laid low and kept still, and never shoved out till nearly 10 o'clock. Then we slid by, pretty wide away from the town, and didn't hoist our lantern till we was clear out of sight of it. When Jim called me to take the watch at 4 in the morning, he says,
Huck, do you reckon we're going to run across any more kings on this trip?
No, I says, I reckon not.
Well,
says he,
that's all right then. I don't mind 1 or 2 kings, but that's enough. This one's powerful drunk, and the Duke ain't much better.
I found Jim had been trying to get him to talk French, so he could hear what it was like, but he said he had been in this country so long, and had so much trouble, he forgot it. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 21 Sword Exercise. Hamlet's Soliloquy. They loafed around town. A lazy town. Old Boggs. Dead. It was after sunup now, but we went right on and didn't tie up. The King and the Duke turned out by and by looking pretty rusty, but after they'd jumped overboard and took a swim, it chippered them up a good deal. After breakfast, the King, he took a seat on the corner of the raft, and pulled off his boots and rolled up his breeches, and let his legs dangle in the water, so as to be comfortable, and lit his pipe, and went to getting his Romeo and Juliet by heart. When he had got it pretty good, him and the Duke began to practice it together. The Duke had to learn him over and over again how to say every speech, and he made him sigh, and put his hand on his heart, and after a while he said he'd done it pretty well.
Only,
he says,
you mustn't bellow out Romeo that way, like a bull. You must say it soft and sick and languishy, so Romeo. That is the idea. For Juliet's a dear, sweet, mere child of a girl, you know, and she doesn't braid like a jackass.
Well, next they got out a couple of long swords that the Duke made out of oak laths, and begun to practice the sword fight. The Duke called himself Richard III, and the way they laid on and pranced about the raft was grand to see. But by and by the King tripped and fell overboard, and after that they took a rest, and had to talk about all kinds of adventures they'd had in other times along the river. And after dinner the Duke says,
Well, Capet, we'll want to make this a first-class show, you know, so I guess we'll add a little more to it. We want a little something to answer encores with anyway.
What's encores? Bilgewater?
the Duke told him, and then says,
I'll answer by doing the Highland Fling or the Sailor's Hornpipe, and you, well, let me see. Oh, I've got it. You can do Hamlet's Soliloquy.
Hamlet's which?
Hamlet's Soliloquy. You know, the most celebrated thing in Shakespeare. Ah, it's sublime, sublime. Always fetches the house. I haven't got it in the book. I've only got 1 volume, but I reckon I can piece it out from memory. I'll just walk up and down a minute and see if I can call it back from Recollection's vaults.
So he went to marching up and down, thinking, and frowning horrible every now and then. Then he would hoist up his eyebrows. Next he would squeeze his hand on his forehead, and stagger back a kind of moan. Next he would sigh, and next he let on to drop a tear. It was beautiful to see him. By and by he got it. He told us to give attention. Then he strikes a most noble attitude, with one leg shoved forwards, and his arms stretched away up, and his head tilted back, looking up at the sky, and then he begins to rip and rave and grit his teeth, and after that, all through his speech he howled, and spread around, and swelled up his chest, and just knocked the spots out of any actor ever I have seen before. This is the speech. I learned it easy enough, while he was learning it to the king.
To be or not to be, that is the bare bodkin that makes calamity of so long life. For who would Fidel's bear till Burnham wood do come to Dunsinane, but that the fear of something after death murders the innocent sleep, great nature's second course, and makes hers rather sling the arrows of outrageous fortune than fly to others that we know not of. There's the respect must give us pause. Wake Duncan with thy knocking. I would thou couldst. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the law's delay, and the quietus which his pangs might take? In the dead waste and middle of the night, when churchyards yawn in customary suits of solemn black, but that the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, breathes forth contagion on the world, and thus the native hue of resolution, like the poor cat, the adage, is sickled o'er with care, and all the clouds that lowered o'er our housetops with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. But soft you, the fair Ophelia, up not thy ponderous and marble jaws, but get thee to a nunnery. Go.
Well, the old man, he liked that speech, and he might as soon got it so he could do the first rate. It seemed like he was just born for it, and when he had his hand in and was excited, it was perfectly lovely the way he would rip and tear and rear up behind when he was getting it off. The first chance he got, the Duke, he had some show bills printed, and after that, for 2 or 3 days, as we floated along, the raft was a most uncommon lively place, for there weren't nothing but sore fighting and rehearsing, as the Duke called it, going on all the time. One morning, when we was pretty well down the state of Arkansas, we come in sight of a little one-horse town in a big bend, so we tied up about 3/4 of a mile above it in the mouth of a crick, which was shut in like a tunnel by the cypress trees, and all of us but Jim took the canoe and went down there to see if there was any chance in that place for our show. We struck it mighty lucky. There was going to be a circus there that afternoon, and the country people was already beginning to come in all kinds of old shaggy wagons and on horses. The circus would leave before night, so our show would have a pretty good chance. The Duke, he hired the courthouse, and we went around and stuck up our bills. They read like this: Shakespearean Revival, wonderful attraction, for one night only. The world-renowned tragedians, David Garrick the Younger, of Drury Lane Theatre, London, and Edmund Kean the Elder, of the Royal Haymarket Theatre, Whitechapel, Pudding Lane, Piccadilly, London, and the Royal Continental Theatres, and their sublime Shakespearean spectacle, entitled The Balcony Scene in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo, Mr. Garrick; Juliet, Mr. Kean. Assisted by the whole strength of the company. New costumes, new scenery, new appointments. Also the thrilling, masterly, and blood-curdling broadsword conflict in Richard III. Richard III, Mr. Garrick; Richmond, Mr. Kean. Also, by special request, Hamlet's immortal soliloquy, by the illustrious Kean, done by him 300 consecutive nights in Paris, for one night only, on account of imperative European engagements. Admission 25 cents, children and servants 10 cents. Then we went loafing around town. The stores and houses were most all old shackety dried up frame concerns that hadn't ever been painted. They was set up 3 or 4 foot above ground on stilts, so as to be out of reach of the water when the river was overflowed. The houses had little gardens around them, but they didn't seem to raise hardly anything in them but jimpson weeds and sunflowers and ash piles, and old curled up boots and shoes, and pieces of bottles and rags, and played out tinware. The fences was made of different kinds of boards, nailed on at different times, and they leaned every which way, and had gates that didn't generally have but one hinge, a leather one. Some of the fences had been whitewashed, some time or another, but the Duke said it was in Columbus's time, likely enough. There was generally hogs in the garden, and people driving them out. All the stores was along one street. They had white domestic awnings in front, and the country people hitched their horses to the awning posts. There was empty dry goods boxes under the awnings, and loafers roasting on them all day long, whittling them with their Barlow knives, and chawing tobacco, and gaping and yawning and stretching, a mighty ornery lot. They generally had on yellow straw hats most as wide as an umbrella, but didn't wear no coats or waistcoats. They called one another Bill, and Buck, and Hank, and Joe, and Andy, and talked lazy and drawly, and used considerable many cuss words. There was as many as one loafer leaning up against every awning post, and he most always had his hands in his breeches pockets, except when he fetched them out to lend a chaw of tobacco or scratch. What a body was hearing amongst them all the time was,
"Give me a chaw of tobaccer, Hank."
Can't. I ain't got but one chaw left. Ask Bill.
Maybe Bill, he gives him a chaw. Sometimes he lies and says he ain't got none. Some of them kind of loafers never has a cent in the world, nor a chaw of tobacco of their own. They get all their chawing by borrowing. They say to a fellow,
I wisht you'd lend me a chaw, Jack. I'd just this minute give Ben Thompson the last chaw I had.
which is a lie pretty much every time. It don't fool nobody but a stranger, but Jack ain't no stranger, so he says,
"You give him a chaw, did you? So did your sister's cat's grandmother. You pay me back the chaws you've already borrowed off me, Leif Buckner, then I'll loan you 1 or 2 ton of it, and won't charge you no back interest nuther."
Well, I did pay you back some of it onct.
"Yes, you did. 'Bout 6 chaws. You borrowed store tobaccer and paid back niggerhead."
store tobacco is flat black plug, but these fellows mostly chaws the natural leaf twisted. When they borrow a chaw, they don't generally cut it off with a knife, but set the plug in between their teeth, and gnaw with their teeth, and tug at the plug with their hands till they get it in two. Then sometimes the one that owns the tobacco looks mournful at it when it's handed back, and says sarcastic,
"Here, give me the chaw, and you take the plug."
all the streets and lanes was just mud. They weren't nothing else but mud, mud as black as tar and nigh about a foot deep in some places, and 2 or 3 inches deep in all places. The hogs loafed and grunted around everywheres. You'd see a mighty sow and a litter of pigs come lazying along the street, and wallop herself right down in the way, where folks had to walk around her, and she'd stretch out and shut her eyes, and wave her ears while the pigs was milking her, and look as happy as if she was on salary. And pretty soon you'd hear a loafer singing out,
Hi, so boy, sick him, Tige.
and away the sow would go, squealing most horrible, with a dog or 2 swinging to each ear, and 3 or 4 dozen more a comin', and then you would see all the loafers get up and watch the thing out of sight, and laugh at the fun, and look grateful for the noise. Then they settled back again till there was a dog fight. There couldn't anything wake them up all over, and make them happy all over, like a dog fight, unless it might be putting turpentine on a stray dog, and setting fire to him, or tying a tin pan to his tail, and see him run himself to death. On the river front some of the houses was sticking out over the bank, and they was bowed and bent, and about ready to tumble in. The people had to move out of them. The bank was caved away under one corner of some others, and that corner was hanging over. People lived in them yet, but it was dangersome, because sometimes a strip of land, as wide as a house, caves in at a time. Sometimes a belt of land, a quarter of a mile deep, will start in, and cave along till it all caves into the river in one summer. Such a town as that has to be always moving back and back and back, because the river's always gnawing at it. The nearer it got to noon that day, the thicker and thicker was the wagons and horses in the streets, and more coming all the time. Families fetched their dinners with them from the country, and eat them in the wagons. There was considerable whiskey drinking going on, and I see 3 fights. By and by somebody sings out,
"Here comes old Boggs in from the country for his little old monthly drunk. Here he comes, boys."
All the loafers looked glad. I reckon they was used to having fun out of Boggs. One of them says,
Wonder who he's a-gwine to chaw up this time. If he'd a chawed up all the men he's been a-gwine to chaw up in the last 20 year, he'd have considerable reputation now.
Another one says,
"I wisht old Boggs to threaten me, 'cause then I'd know I wa'n't gwine to die for 1,000 year."
Boggs comes a-tearing along on his horse, whooping and yelling like a Injun, and singing out,
"Clear the track there! I'm on the warpath, and the price of coffins is a-going to rise."
He was drunk, and weaving about in his saddle. He was over 50-year-old, and had a very red face. Everybody yelled at him, and laughed at him, and sassed him, and he sassed back, and said he'd attend to them and lay them out in their regular turns, but he couldn't wait now because he came to town to kill old Colonel Sherburne, and his motto was,
"Meat first and spoon victuals to top off on."
He see me, and rode up and says,
"Where'd you come from, boy? You prepared to die?"
Then he rode on. I was scared, but a man says,
"He don't mean nothing. He's always a carrying on like that when he's drunk. He's the best naturedest old fool in Arkansas. Never hurt nobody, drunk nor sober."
Boggs rode up before the biggest store in town, and bent his head down so he could see under the curtain of the awning, and yells,
"Come out here, Sherburne. Come out and meet the man you've swindled. You're the hound I'm after, and I'm going to have you too."
And so he went on, calling Sherburne everything he could lay his tongue to, and the whole street packed with people listening and laughing and going on. By and by a proud-looking man about 55, and he was a heap the best dressed man in that town too, steps out of a store, and the crowd drops back on each side to let him come. He says to Boggs, mighty calm and slow, he says,
"I'm tired of this, but I'll endure it till 1 o'clock. Till 1 o'clock, mind, no longer. If you open your mouth against me only once after that time, you can't travel so far, but I will find you."
Then he turns and goes in. The crowd looked mighty sober. Nobody stirred, and there weren't no more laughing. Boggs rode off blackguarding Sherburne as loud as he could yell all down the street, and pretty soon back he comes, and stops before the store, still keeping it up. Some men crowded around him and tried to get him to shut up, but he weren't. They told him it would be 1 o'clock in about 15 minutes, and so he must go home. He must go right away. But it didn't do no good. He cussed away with all his might, and throwed his hat down in the mud and rode over it, and pretty soon away he went a raging down the street again, with his gray hair a flying. Everybody that could get a chance at him tried their best to coax him off of his horse so they could lock him up and get him sober, but it weren't no use. Up the street he could tear again, and give Sherburne another cussin'. By and by somebody says,
"Go for his daughter! Quick! Go for his daughter! Sometimes he'll listen to her. If anybody can persuade him, she can."
So somebody started on a run. I walked down the street a ways and stopped. In about 5 or 10 minutes here comes Boggs again, but not on his horse. He was a reelin' across the street toward me, bareheaded, with a friend on both sides of him a holt of his arms and hurrying him along. He was quiet and looked uneasy, and he weren't hanging back any, but was doing some of the hurrying himself. Somebody sings out,
"Boggs."
I looked over there to see who said it, and it was that Colonel Sherburne. He was standing perfectly still in the street, and had a pistol raised in his right hand, not aiming it, but holding it out with the barrel tilted up toward the sky. The same second I see a young girl come on the run, and 2 men with her. Boggs and the men turned round to see who called 'em, and when they see the pistol the men jumped to one side, and the pistol barrel came down slow and steady to a level, both barrels cocked. Boggs throws up both of his hands and says,
"Oh, Lord, don't shoot."
Bang! Goes the first shot, and he staggers back, clawing at the air. Bang! Goes the second one, and he tumbles backwards onto the ground, heavy and solid, with his arms spread out. That young girl screamed out and comes a rushin', and down she throws herself onto her father, crying and saying,
"Oh, he's killed him! He's killed him!"
The crowd closed up around them, and shouldered and jammed one another, with their necks stretched, trying to see, and people on the inside trying to shove them back and shouting,
"Back, back! Give him air! Give him air!"
Colonel Sherburne, he tossed his pistol on the ground, and turned around on his heels and walked off. They took Boggs to a little drug store, the crowd pressing around just the same, and the whole town following, and I rushed and got a good place at the window, where I was close to him and could see in. They laid him on the floor, and put one large Bible under his head, and opened another one and spread it on his breast. But they tore open his shirt first, and I seen where one of the bullets went in. He made about a dozen long gasps, his breast, lifting the Bible up when he drawed in his breath, and letting it down again when he breathed it out, and after that he laid still. He was dead. Then they pulled his daughter away from him, screaming and crying, and took her off. She was about 16, and very sweet and gentle looking, but awful pale and scared. Well, pretty soon the whole town was there, squirming and scourging and pushing and shoving to get at the window and have a look. But people that had the places wouldn't give them up, and folks behind them was saying all the time,
"Say now, you've looked enough, you fellows."
"'Tain't right, and 'tain't fair for you to stay thar all the time, and never give nobody a chance."
"Other folks has their rights as well as you."
There was considerable jawing back, so I slid out, thinking maybe there was going to be trouble. The streets was full, and everybody was excited. Everybody that seen the shooting was telling how it happened, and there was a big crowd packed around each one of these fellows, stretching their necks and listening. One long, lanky man, with long hair and a big, white fur stovepipe hat on the back of his head, and a crooked-handled cane, marked out of the places on the ground where Boggs stood and where Sherburne stood, and the people following him around from one place to the other, and watching everything he done, and bobbing their heads to show they understood, and stooping a little and resting their hands on the thighs to watch him mark the places on the ground with his cane, and then he stood up straight and stiff where Sherburne had stood, frowning and having his hat brimmed down over his eyes, and sung out,
"Boggs!"
and then fetched his cane down slow to a level, and says,
"Bang!"
staggered backwards, and says,
"Bang!"
again, and fell down flat on his back. The people that had seen the thing said he done it perfect, said it was just exactly the way it all happened. Then as much as a dozen people got out their bottles and treated him. Well, by and by, somebody said Sherburne ought to be lynched. In about a minute everybody was saying it, so away they went, mad and yelling, and snatching down every clothesline they come to do the hanging with. End of chapter 21.